It didn't begin with bombs or battlefields. It began quietly, in meetings, in whispers, in a jungle half a world away. A country few Americans could find on a map would soon shape the soul of a generation. The Vietnam War lasted 20 years. Millions died, millions more were never the same. It was a war without clear victories, without clear villains, without a clean ending. It was fought in rice fields and rainforest, in cities and swamps, and in the minds of those who lived through it. Presidents promised peace, generals chased ghosts, and soldiers fought an enemy they couldn't always see. Some fought to stop communism, others to break free from foreign rule, but in the end, no one left untouched. This is the story of Vietnam, not just the war, but what it did to the world and to the people who lived it. This is how it started, and how it all fell apart. Chapter 1. Echoes of Empire. For nearly 100 years, Vietnam was not its own. It lived in the shadow of another flag, the flag of France. The French didn't arrive as guests. They came with guns, ships, and the promise of civilizing a land they saw as wild. They called it Indochina, a piece of their empire in Asia taken by force, held by fear. But the Vietnamese were not silent. Beneath the surface of everyday life, in the rice paddies, the mountains, the narrow city, alleys, resistance began to grow, quiet at first, then louder. To understand the Vietnam War, we have to go back to the 1800s when French soldiers first set foot on Vietnamese soil and decided to stay. France turned Vietnam into a colony. They ruled through governors. They built railways, ports, and plantations, not for the Vietnamese people but for profit. Rubber, rice, coal, all shipped away to feed the empire. The Vietnamese worked under hard conditions. Many were poor, some starved. And while the French built grand buildings in Hanoi and Saigon, most locals lived in small homes, barely getting by. There were schools, yes, but mostly for the French and a few Vietnamese elites trained to serve them. And yet, something dangerous to colonial rule was quietly rising. An idea. The idea of freedom. The idea that Vietnam could be its own. At the heart of that dream was a man named Nguyen Quoc. The world would later know him as Ho Chi Minh. He had traveled the world, living in France, the Soviet Union, even the United States. He saw how empires ruled and how they could fall. He read about revolution. He believed that Vietnam didn't need to wait politely for freedom. It had to take it. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but to most Vietnamese, he was more than that. He was a symbol, a man who spoke their pain, their hopes, their hunger for dignity. During World War II, Vietnam's chance came. France was weak, occupied by the Nazis. In Asia, Japan invaded. The Japanese took control of Vietnam, but they let the French stay in place. For the Vietnamese, it was just one foreign master replaced by another. That's when Ho Chi Minh and his group, the Viet Minh, rose up. The Viet Minh were a mix of fighters and thinkers, farmers with rifles, students with dreams. They fought. The Japanese using guerrilla tactics. They hid in forests, struck at night, vanished by morning. And by 1945, when Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, the Viet Minh were ready. They declared independence. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd and read a declaration, echoing the words of Thomas Jefferson, "All men are created equal." For a moment, it seemed Vietnam would finally be free, but freedom didn't come. France returned, determined to take back what it saw as its colony. They refused to recognize Vietnam's independence. Talks failed, guns were raised, and so, in 1946, a new war began, the First Indochina War. It wasn't just about Vietnam anymore. It was about empires clinging to life, and revolutions trying to break free. The French had tanks, planes, and foreign support. The Viet Minh had the land, the people, and an iron will. The war was brutal. Cities were bombed, villages burned, families torn apart. But the Viet Minh refused to surrender. They knew they could not win in open battle, so they didn't fight that way. They struck from the jungle, used the land as their ally. They turned the French's strength into weakness. And then came 1954. In the far northwest of Vietnam, deep in a valley surrounded by hills, the French chose their final stand, a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French believed it was perfect, easy to defend, hard to reach. They built a fortress there, dropped in thousands of soldiers and supplies, certain they would draw the Viet Minh into a trap. But they had miscalculated. The Viet Minh, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, did the unthinkable. They moved tens of thousands of troops through harsh terrain. They hauled artillery, some by hand and over mountains. They dug trenches, inching closer day by day. They built tunnels. They surrounded Dien Bien Phu like tightening rope. The French didn't see it coming, and when the first shells fell, it was already too late. For nearly 2 months the siege raged. Rain poured, mud thickened. Planes tried to drop supplies but were shot down. French soldiers were trapped. Morale broke. One by one, their positions fell, and on May 7, 1954, the French fortress collapsed. Thousands surrendered. It was more than a military defeat. It was the end of France's empire in Asia. The world took notice. In Geneva, world powers gathered to decide Vietnam's future. They drew a line, not with care, but with politics. The country was split in two: North Vietnam, controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists; South Vietnam, backed by the West, led by anti-communist politicians. It was meant to be temporary. Elections were promised, but those elections never came. The North prepared for reunification. The South tried to build a new government, supported by money and weapons from America, but underneath the surface, tension burned. One war had ended. Another was quietly beginning. Chapter 2. A Nation Divided. When the guns fell silent at Dien Bien Phu, the French knew it was over. Their empire in Southeast Asia had collapsed. For Vietnam, it was a moment that should have meant freedom. Instead, it became the start of something even more uncertain and far more dangerous. In July 1954, world powers met in Switzerland. The city was Geneva. Around the table sat diplomats from France, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. North Vietnam sent representatives. South Vietnam did not. The meeting was called the Geneva Conference. Its goal to stop the fighting in Indochina. Not just in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. But in truth, it was about control, about influence, about the Cold War. The world was no longer just East and West. It was communist versus capitalist. Every country that changed hands was a win or a loss in this growing global game. Vietnam became the prize. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had won the war. But they hadn't yet won the country. Their goal was simple: full independence and reunification. One Vietnam under one government. But that dream would be delayed by politics, fear, and foreign pressure. At Geneva, the great powers didn't trust each other. The West feared that if all of Vietnam fell under communist rule, nearby nations, Laos, Cambodia, maybe even Thailand, would fall next. This was the famous domino theory. If one fell, the rest would follow. So a compromise was made. Vietnam would be temporarily divided, not by mountains or rivers, but by a line. The 17th parallel, north of that line, Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would control the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. South of that line, a non-communist government would form, later called the Republic of Vietnam. This was not a final decision. It was meant to be temporary. Both sides agreed to hold national elections in 1956, just 2 years later, to let the Vietnamese people choose their future. One vote, one country, one Vietnam. But that election never happened, and in that broken promise, the seeds of war were planted. In the north, Ho Chi Minh began to rebuild. His government was disciplined, strict, and determined. He introduced land reforms, re-educated former enemies, and began laying the foundation for a unified socialist Vietnam. Life was difficult, but to many in the north, the sacrifices were worth it. They had fought for independence. Now they were building something new. In the south, things were less stable. The man chosen to lead was Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist in a mostly Buddhist country. He was strongly anti-communist, well-educated, and deeply conservative. The United States saw Diem as the best hope to stop communism from spreading in Southeast Asia, so they supported him with money, training, and weapons. Diem quickly took power, but not through democracy. He crushed his rivals, refused to hold the promised elections, and declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam in 1955 after a rigged referendum. Ballots were stuffed, opposition was silenced, and the number of yes votes in some areas was higher than the number of registered voters. Still, the United States backed him. President Eisenhower later admitted that if elections had been held in 1956, Ho Chi Minh would have easily won, maybe by 80% or more. That frightened the West. They believed a communist Vietnam would weaken American influence in Asia. So, they chose stability over fairness, control over consent. But in choosing Diem, they also chose conflict. Diem ruled with an iron hand. He trusted only his family and a small circle of elites. He cracked down on political opponents. He banned communist parties, jailed critics, and silenced Buddhist leaders. He called it protection. Others called it repression. In the countryside, thousands who had once supported the Viet Minh now faced harassment. Former fighters were hunted down. Villages that had once resisted the French now resisted Diem. And in the north, Ho Chi Minh watched closely. The hope of peaceful reunification faded. In its place, a new plan began to form, to reunify Vietnam not by elections, but by force. The North began supporting communist sympathizers in the South. These groups would later become known as the Viet Cong, a shortened form of Vietnamese communists. They weren't always trained soldiers. Many were farmers, teachers, and workers, angry at the Diem regime, desperate for change. They didn't wear uniforms. They moved silently through jungles and villages. They hid by day, attacked by night. Their weapons were simple, but their cause was fierce. They weren't just fighting Diem, they were fighting for the dream of one Vietnam. To the South Vietnamese government and their American backers, these rebels were terrorists. To others, they were freedom fighters. By the late 1950s, the conflict was growing, slowly but steadily. Ambushes, assassinations, bombings. The roads were no longer safe. American military advisors arrived to help train South Vietnamese troops. At first, they stayed in the background, but their numbers began to grow. What started as a civil conflict was becoming something more. Meanwhile, the Diem government became more isolated. His obsession with loyalty blinded him to the suffering of his people. He favored Catholic allies, ignored the needs of Buddhists, who made up the majority. In 1963, when Buddhist monks began protesting his policies, Diem responded with violence. In one of the most shocking moments of the early war, a Buddhist monk named Thish Quang Duc sat down in the middle of a busy street in Saigon, poured gasoline over his head and set himself on fire. He did not move, he did not cry out. He burned in silence and a protest against Diem's brutality. The image stunned the world. Diem had lost the confidence of his people. And slowly he lost the confidence of the United States. Later that year, South Vietnamese generals staged a coup. With quiet support from the US, they overthrew Diem. He was arrested and then assassinated. It was a turning point, not just for South Vietnam, but for America. Because without Diem, the South had no strong leader, and the North was watching, waiting, preparing. The Geneva Accords had been broken. The elections never came. The temporary line at the 17th parallel had become a real border, a symbol of a nation divided. But Vietnam was never meant to be two countries. Not in its history, not in its heart. The North still believed in reunification, the South still feared invasion, and caught in the middle were millions of ordinary people, farmers, students, mothers, soldiers, who just wanted peace. But peace was no longer possible. America was now more involved than ever. Advisors had turned into decision-makers, support had turned into strategy, and war was no longer a question of if, but when. The path to full-scale conflict was now wide, open. Chapter 3. Seeds of Insurgency. After the fall of Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam was lost in confusion. The streets of Saigon were tense. The government was leaderless. A dozen generals fought for control. One coup followed another. Power shifted like sand in the wind. Washington watched nervously, realizing that the South, the country America had chosen to protect, was far weaker than anyone had admitted. But this chapter of the story doesn't begin in the capital. It begins far away from the headlines. In the rice fields, in the jungles, in the villages where the real war was quietly taking shape. The Viet Minh, the fighters who had once battled the French, hadn't disappeared. After the Geneva Accords split Vietnam in 1954, many went home to the north. But others stayed behind. Some hid their weapons, some buried their radios, some simply waited. And when the promised elections never came, they started to move. What began as whispers turned into meetings. What began as quiet resistance turned into action. The new generation of fighters in the South called themselves the National Liberation Front. But the world would come to know them by another name, the Viet Cong. They weren't a regular army. They didn't have tanks or uniforms or large bases, but they had something just as powerful, a cause. They believed the South Vietnamese government was corrupt, controlled by foreign powers, and deaf to the needs of its own people. They saw themselves as liberators. The Viet Cong worked in shadows. They used the jungle as their shield. They didn't wear insignias. One moment, they were farmers. The next, they were soldiers. They planted bombs on roads, they ambushed convoys. They attacked outposts and disappeared into the night. They killed South Vietnamese officials, mayors, policemen, anyone seen as a puppet of the regime. At first, their numbers were small. But as Diem's rule tightened and his repression deepened, more people joined them. Some out of anger, some out of desperation, some because they had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh and his top commander, General Vo, Nguyen Giap, were watching. They believed reunification could no longer happen through peaceful means. The South would never allow an election, and the Americans would never allow a communist victory. So the North began supporting the growing insurgency in the South, not with open armies, but with roads, trails, and silent couriers. That's when the Ho Chi Minh Trail was born. It wasn't a single road. It was a network of jungle paths, stretching through Laos and Cambodia, weaving around mountains and rivers. Supplies, weapons, and soldiers flowed down this trail, day and night, carried by hand, by bicycle, by pack animal, and all of it, hidden under thick forest canopies, invisible from the sky. It was one of the most ambitious supply networks ever built, and the United States would spend years trying and failing to shut it down. While the North prepared for war, they were also transforming society at home. In the early 1950s, Ho Chi Minh launched a massive land reform campaign. The idea was simple: take land from the wealthy landlords and give it to the peasants. It was meant to be revolutionary, a way to empower the poor and weaken the old feudal system. But in practice, it was brutal. Landowners were labeled class enemies. Public trials were held. Accusations flew. Thousands were executed. Many more were imprisoned or driven from their homes. Some were guilty of cruelty. Others were targeted out of jealousy or old grudges. The campaign left deep scars. Families were torn apart. Villages split. Even loyal communists began to question the harshness of the policies. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh admitted mistakes were made. He scaled back the reforms. Some officials were punished, but the damage was done. Still, for many poor farmers, the land reforms had a lasting effect. For the first time, they owned the soil they worked. They had reason to fight, not just for the revolution, but for their own small piece of Vietnam. In the South, the picture looked very different. Diem had promised to reform land ownership too, but little changed. Large landlords kept their estates. Rent was high. Poor farmers remained trapped in debt, working land they would never own. Some hoped for help from the government. Others began listening to the Viet Cong. The US tried to help Diem build a stable South Vietnam. They sent aid, weapons, and military advisors. They trained South Vietnamese troops, they built airfields and roads, but they couldn't fix the real problem. Diem didn't have the trust of his people. He ruled from behind walls, surrounded by loyalists. His secret police arrested critics. His army was loyal more to individuals than to the nation. Corruption was everywhere. And worse, Diem didn't understand the rural villages where most Vietnamese people lived. He saw them as places to be controlled, not communities to be supported. So he launched a program called Agroville, which forced villagers to relocate into government-controlled camps. It was meant to isolate them from the Viet Cong. Instead, it pushed them closer. By the late 1950s, attacks by the Viet Cong were increasing. Ambushes became common. Assassinations grew. In 1959, American soldiers were killed in Vietnam for the first time. 2 military advisors shot at a base near Bien Hoa. It was a small moment, but a deadly one. More troops followed. By 1960, the US had nearly 1,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. President Eisenhower warned his successor, John F. Kennedy, that Southeast Asia was in danger. He said if Vietnam fell to communism, others would follow. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even Indonesia, Kennedy believed it. He had campaigned as a Cold Warrior, a president who would stand firm against the spread of communism. So when he took office, he increased America's commitment. He sent more advisors, more weapons. He supported Diem. But privately, even, Kennedy had doubts. In 1961, Kennedy approved the use of helicopters in Vietnam. He allowed US pilots to fly support missions. Though they weren't officially in combat, they were getting closer. Some returned in body bags, others never returned at all. At the same time, the Viet Cong were growing stronger. Their attacks became bolder. Their recruitment grew. They built underground tunnels, trained in the jungle, and spread their message village by village. They weren't just fighting a government. They were offering an alternative, and for many in the countryside, forgotten by Saigon, ignored by generals, it was tempting. By 1962, South Vietnam's government claimed it controlled most of the country, but in reality, the Viet Cong had presence in over half of the villages. The South was bleeding, slowly, quietly, and dangerously. Kennedy knew things were getting worse, but he wasn't ready to send in combat troops, not yet. He hoped that with enough training, enough support, the South could hold its own. But the truth was becoming clear. Diem's regime was too weak, too corrupt, and too hated to survive on its own. And in the north, Ho Chi Minh and his commanders had made their choice. Reunification would come, not through negotiation, not through elections, but through insurgency, through revolution, through war. Chapter 4. Advisors and Assassinations. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was no longer just a Vietnamese problem. It had become an American problem, and it was about to become much bigger. After the split in 1954, the United States had poured money and support into South Vietnam. At first it was economic aid and political advice, then came military equipment and training missions. But the deeper the crisis grew, the harder it was to stay in the background. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the US believed it could stop the spread of communism without direct combat. He wanted to build up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, so they could fight the Viet Cong on their own. American advisors arrived in increasing numbers. They were there to guide, to instruct, and to help plan operations, not to fight. But the line between support and combat kept getting thinner. Eisenhower saw Vietnam as part of the bigger Cold War chessboard. After China fell to communism in 1949, and after the Korean War split the peninsula in two, US leaders feared a similar outcome in Southeast Asia. To them, South Vietnam was a frontline state. If it fell, the whole region might follow. This was the famous domino theory in action. Eisenhower's strategy was to help Diem turn the Republic of Vietnam into a strong anti-communist state, a stable democracy armed and trained by the West. But there was a flaw. Diem was never truly democratic, and his rule was growing more brutal by the day. When John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited a mess. The Viet Cong were gaining ground. Diem's unpopularity was worsening. American advisors were already being killed. Kennedy had to make a choice, pull back or lean in. He chose to lean in. Kennedy believed in counterinsurgency, the idea that small mobile forces could fight and win against guerrilla fighters. He increased the number of US military advisors in Vietnam from about 900 in 1960 to over 16,000 by 1963. Officially, they weren't combat troops, but they carried weapons, they flew missions, they died in ambushes. To many, they were already at war. Kennedy also approved the use of US helicopters to support South Vietnamese troops. It was one of the first times air mobility became a major tool in guerrilla warfare. Soldiers could now be dropped deep into enemy territory in minutes, then lifted out before the Viet Cong could regroup. But even with all this support, the war wasn't going well. The Viet Cong were still growing. In some provinces, they controlled the countryside by night, even if the government held the cities by day. They had their own schools, their own courts, and a shadow administration in many rural areas. The problem wasn't just military, it was political. Ngo Dinh Diem's government was cracking from the inside. Diem ruled with his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, who acted as chief political advisor and ran the feared secret police. The Nhus created a regime of fear, arrests without trial, censorship, torture chambers. They spied on students, monks, and even army officers. Any hint of disloyalty was punished. But what really turned public opinion against Diem was his treatment of Buddhists. Vietnam was a Buddhist majority country, but Diem's government favored Catholics. Catholics received better jobs, land, and promotions. In 1963, Diem banned the Buddhist flag from flying during religious festivals, even though Catholic symbols were allowed. That sparked a crisis. In May, Buddhist protesters gathered in the city of Hue. Government troops opened fire. 9 people were killed, including children. Instead of apologizing, Diem blamed the protesters. Buddhists across the country erupted in anger. Monks marched in silence. Some went on hunger strikes. Others began a new, heartbreaking form of protest. On June 11, 1963, in the heart of Saigon, a monk named Tish Quang Duc sat down on a busy street, poured gasoline over his head, and lit himself on fire. He did not flinch. He did not scream. He sat calmly as the flames consumed him. Photographs of the moment shocked the world. Americans were stunned. Journalists, soldiers, and diplomats alike questioned the very foundation of US support in Vietnam. Kennedy was horrified. More monks followed, more self-immolations. Diem's response? Denial. His brother Nhu laughed it off. His wife, the infamous Madame Nhu, called the burnings barbecues. The White House could no longer look away. Diem had become a liability. US officials began secretly speaking with South Vietnamese generals. The message was subtle, but clear. If Diem were overthrown, America would not stand in the way. In August 1963, Kennedy sent a cable authorizing US Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge to explore alternate leadership. The wheels of a coup were now turning, but Kennedy hesitated. He didn't want direct involvement. He didn't want blood on America's hands. Still, the generals moved forward. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese troops surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and Nhu fled through a secret tunnel. They tried to negotiate safe passage. They were captured the next day. And then, without trial, without warning, they were executed in the back of an armored vehicle. Shot at close range, their bodies dumped, bloodied, broken. The news reached Washington within hours. Kennedy was shaken. He hadn't ordered the killings, but he knew America had played a role. The CIA had passed messages. The ambassador had stood by. The advisors had looked the other way. Kennedy said, "We must bear a good deal of responsibility." Just 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself would be assassinated in Dallas. The world changed again. In Vietnam, chaos followed. The generals who overthrew Diem couldn't agree on who should lead. One coup followed another. Military rule replaced civilian rule, and then back again. Each new leader was weaker than the last. Corruption spread like a disease. America had hoped Diem's fall would stabilize South Vietnam. Instead, it made things worse. The Viet Cong celebrated. The northern communists saw opportunity. In their eyes, the South was crumbling. The time to strike was coming. The US was now caught in a trap of its own making. It had removed a dictator but found no better alternative. It had sent advisors but now needed soldiers. It had hoped for a quick fix but got a slow disaster. And yet, no one in Washington wanted to pull out. To leave now would mean admitting failure, losing face, letting communism spread. And so under a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, America's involvement would deepen. The advisors would soon become troops. The whispers of war were turning into thunder. The assassination of DM marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, far more dangerous one. A chapter of escalation, of bombing campaigns, of jungles on fire and skies full of helicopters. The Vietnam War was no longer just brewing. It was about to explode. Chapter 5. Tonkin Lies and War Cries. The year was 1964. Vietnam was already a smoldering battlefield, but it hadn't yet exploded into a full-blown American war. At least, not officially. After Ngo Dinh Diem's assassination, South Vietnam fell into political chaos. The government changed hands constantly. One military leader after another tried to take control. None could bring stability. None could stop the Viet Cong. Meanwhile, the United States watched, worried. President Lyndon B. Johnson had taken over after Kennedy's death. He wasn't a war hero. He wasn't a Cold War strategist. He was a political powerhouse focused on domestic reform, civil rights, and the so-called Great Society. But Johnson couldn't ignore Vietnam. He had inherited Kennedy's war. And in 1964, the question wasn't whether America should get involved. The question was how much. The answer would come from the waters of the South China Sea. It began with a pair of U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam. Officially, these ships were on routine patrol, but in reality, they were part of Operation 34A, a secret mission that involved South Vietnamese forces attacking North Vietnamese radar stations and coastal installations. The US wasn't directly bombing the North yet, but it was gathering intelligence, watching, probing, pushing. On August 2, 1964, the Maddox reported being approached by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The US ship fired warning shots. The North Vietnamese fired back. A brief sea battle followed. Torpedoes were launched, though none hit. The Maddox returned fire, damaging at least one of the boats. No Americans were killed. That was the first incident. It was tense but limited. Johnson was informed. He chose not to escalate. The Navy reinforced the area, adding the Turner Joy. The ships continued their patrol. Then came August 4th. On that night, in rough seas and under a stormy sky, radar operators aboard the Maddox and Turner Joy believed they were under attack again. They reported torpedoes in the water, enemy boats closing in. Alarms rang, guns fired. The U.S. ships maneuvered wildly, dodging what they believed were incoming attacks. For hours, chaos ruled the decks. But something was wrong. No enemy boats were seen. No hits were confirmed. Radar readings were unclear. I possibly misread. Some sailors later said they saw nothing. Sonar pings may have been shadows, dolphins, or even waves. And yet the Navy reported an attack. In Washington, Johnson didn't wait for confirmation. That same night, he appeared on national television. Calm, serious, presidential. Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. This reply is being given as I speak. American planes were already in the air. They bombed North Vietnamese targets, oil depots, patrol boat bases, and radar stations. Johnson framed it as retaliation, a necessary strike to defend U.S. ships in international waters. He told Congress the U.S. wasn't seeking war, only peace and stability. Most Americans believed him, and then came the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Johnson's team drafted it quickly. It gave the president the authority to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. In short, it was a blank check. Congress passed the resolution almost unanimously. Only 2 senators voted no, Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruning. They saw through the fog of war, but they were alone. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution would become the legal basis for America's full military commitment in Vietnam. It wasn't a declaration of war, but it gave Johnson the power to wage one without asking again. In public, Johnson still sounded cautious. He told the press he had no intention of sending American boys to fight a war that Vietnamese boys should be fighting themselves. But, in private, his mind was shifting. He had already sent more advisors. Now the door was open for combat troops, bombing campaigns and massive escalation. It was a turning point. And yet the truth behind the Gulf of Tonkin incident remained murky. Within weeks, doubts began to surface. Intelligence officers raised concerns. The second attack on August 4th, the one that triggered retaliation, might not have happened at all. Pentagon documents later revealed that senior officials had misled the public. They had cherry-picked evidence. The doubts were kept secret. The narrative was tightly controlled. For years, Americans believed that North Vietnam had attacked U.S. ships without provocation. In reality, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had been provoking the North for months. The Tonkin incident wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. It was a spark. And it lit a fire. By early 1965, Johnson made his decision. He would escalate. The Viet Cong were gaining ground. South Vietnam's army was struggling. Political instability threatened to destroy the country from within. Johnson believed only one thing could save it: American power. He ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to destroy supply lines, cripple morale, and force Hanoi to negotiate. It didn't work. The bombs fell for years. The North did not bend. Then, in March 1965, the first combat troops landed at Da Nang, not advisors, not trainers. Combat. Troops. Marines. America was now fully in the war, and it all traced back to that stormy night in the Gulf of Tonkin, a night of confusion, bad radar, and decisions made too fast. Johnson didn't want to be seen as weak. He didn't want to lose Southeast Asia. He didn't want to be the president who lost Vietnam, the way others were accused of losing China or Korea. But he also didn't tell the full story. And once the bombs began to fall, there was no going back. The war would now stretch for a decade. It would take over 58,000 American lives. It would kill millions of Vietnamese. It would divide a generation, shake the nation's faith, and end in a way no one imagined when it began. And it all started here, in the waters of the Gulf, with a lie wrapped in fear. The cries for war had begun. The advisors had become soldiers, and the Vietnam War, the real war, had officially begun. Chapter 6. Into the Quagmire. March 8, 1965. A date that would change everything. It was early morning when the first U.S. combat troops, 3,500 U.S. Marines, landed on the beaches of Da Nang in South Vietnam. They wore helmets, flak jackets, and carried rifles. Their boots hit the sand not as guests or advisors, but as soldiers preparing for war. The Vietnam War had entered a new phase. Before this, the U.S. role had been mostly behind the scenes, training, advising, planning. But now the gloves were off. America was stepping into the fight directly, and it wouldn't be a quick or easy war. From the outside, the plan looked simple: help South Vietnam defeat communist forces from the north and the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south. Win the battles, build up the government, and stop communism from spreading. But Vietnam was not simple. It was a dense, humid, unfamiliar world. Thick jungles, swamps, mountains, villages that looked peaceful by day, then turned into Viet Cong strongholds at night. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. They didn't drive tanks or march in straight lines. They hid in trees, tunnels, and rice paddies. They knew the terrain. They moved fast, and they had one clear goal: wear down the Americans until they gave up and left. U.S. commanders believed superior firepower would win the war. So they brought in helicopters, bombers, artillery, and armored vehicles. Huge bases were built across South Vietnam: airfields, supply lines, command centers. American soldiers were told they were fighting for freedom, that they were protecting democracy. But once on the ground, many weren't sure who the enemy was, a mafia, or what the mission really meant. The enemy could be anyone. A rice farmer, a teenager, a woman carrying a basket. Then, minutes later, a mine would explode. A shot would ring out from the jungle. A patrol would vanish into the trees and not return. This was the war America walked into, and it was unlike anything they had fought before. U.S. strategy relied on search and destroy missions. Helicopters would drop troops into remote areas. Their job was to find Viet Cong hideouts, destroy supplies, kill fighters, then leave. But the Viet Cong rarely stood and fought. They hit fast, then vanished. They set booby traps, sharpened bamboo spikes hidden in pits, tripwires connected to grenades, landmines buried along footpaths. Even children were used to carry explosives into markets and camps. American soldiers grew frustrated. They couldn't tell friend from foe. Villages that seemed quiet one day could turn deadly the next. And even when they won battles, there was no ground to hold, no enemy flag to capture, no end in sight. The terrain itself was a silent enemy. Vietnam's jungles were thick and dark. The heat was unbearable. Leeches clung to skin. Mosquitoes carried disease. Rain poured for days without stopping. Clothes never dried, feet rotted, spirits broke, and always, there was the waiting, the tension, the fear of ambush. Helicopters became the lifeline of the war. They carried troops, evacuated the wounded, and brought supplies to places no road could reach. Hueys, as they were called, were everywhere, buzzing above treetops, hovering in fire zones, spinning dust as they landed in rice fields. For many soldiers, the whirring sound of rotor blades became the soundtrack of their war. Yet despite the firepower, the Viet Cong kept coming. They used a vast system of underground tunnels, some stretching for miles. In these dark, narrow spaces, they stored weapons, lived, planned attacks, and disappeared from sight. U.S. troops tried to destroy the tunnels, but they kept being rebuilt. Some brave soldiers, called tunnel rats, volunteered to crawl inside, often with just a flashlight and pistol. It was dangerous, claustrophobic, and terrifying. One wrong step could mean death. American commanders measured success by body count, the number of enemy soldiers killed. The higher the count, the closer they believed they were to winning. But this created pressure on field commanders. It encouraged inflated reports. Civilians caught in crossfire were sometimes counted as enemy dead, and it didn't reflect real progress, because even after big battles, the Viet Cong kept coming back. They fought for their homes, their land, their country. For them, it wasn't just a war, it was survival. The U.S. also began relocating rural villages into strategic hamlets, fortified villages meant to protect civilians from Viet Cong influence. But many villagers resented being moved. Their ancestral lands were taken, they were watched by soldiers, and often the Viet Cong still slipped through at night. So instead of winning hearts and minds, these programs sometimes pushed people closer to the communists. Meanwhile, back home in America, the public still supported the war. But that wouldn't last forever. As more troops were sent, more names appeared in the newspapers. Young men who had died far from home, in a place most Americans couldn't even find on a map. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. By 1966, the number had doubled, and by 1967, it had passed 500,000. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than all of World War II combined. Villages were flattened, forests were burned. A chemical called Agent Orange was sprayed across the land to kill crops and expose enemy hiding spots. It left a poisonous legacy: birth defects, cancer, ruined soil. The war was now total, but there was no clear front line, no easy victories, no end date. Some American troops began to question the mission. Why were they there? What were they protecting? Who were they fighting for? Morale started to crack, drug use spread, discipline slipped, racial tensions boiled over. Many soldiers still fought bravely, did their duty, but others simply tried to survive their tour and make it home alive. Meanwhile, in the White House, President Johnson faced a terrible dilemma. He didn't want to lose, but he didn't know how to win. Every year, more troops were sent. Every month, more bombs dropped. But the Viet Cong were not defeated. The North Vietnamese government, led by Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, remained determined and defiant. They believed time was on their side. All they had to do was keep bleeding the Americans until public opinion turned. And that moment was slowly approaching. Still, in 1966 and 1967, Johnson believed victory was possible if he just sent more troops, dropped more bombs, and stayed the course. But Vietnam was not a problem that could be solved with firepower alone. It was a quagmire, a place where every step forward seemed to pull America deeper in. There was no clear exit, no light at the end of the tunnel. Only more jungle, more traps, more confusion. The war had now fully begun, and America was stuck in the middle of it. Chapter 7. War of Shadows. They called it a war. But it was nothing like the wars America had fought before. No front lines, no uniforms, no rules. This was a war fought in the shadows, a place where the enemy disappeared into the trees, into the ground, or into the crowd. A war where victory wasn't measured by territory, but by survival. It was 1966. The US now had over 180,000 troops in Vietnam, and that number was climbing fast. More helicopters, more supplies, more soldiers, and still, no end in sight, because the enemy, the Viet Cong, refused to fight on America's terms. They weren't looking for big battles. They didn't line up in the open. They didn't wear bright colors or drive tanks. They slipped through the jungle in silence. They knew the terrain. They knew the people. They struck hard, then vanished. For American troops, it was like fighting ghosts. This was the War of Shadows. The Viet Cong, or VC, weren't just fighters from the north. They were farmers, mechanics, school teachers, South Vietnamese civilians who believed in the communist cause or had been pressured into helping. They used guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, ambushes, sabotage, traps. They moved at night. They planted landmines during the day. They melted into the jungle, then reappeared miles away. For US forces, it was maddening. You'd patrol a village, smile at the locals, offer food and medicine, then come back the next day to find that same village had hosted VC fighters overnight. Maybe someone had dug a tunnel right under your feet. No one could be trusted. Anyone could be the enemy. This kind of warfare messed with your mind. One moment, you were walking through a rice paddy. The next, a mine goes off. A friend is gone, blood in the water, but no enemy in sight. It wasn't just deadly, it was personal, confusing, cruel. The VC also used booby traps, simple, cheap, but horrifying. Bamboo spikes covered in feces to cause infection. Tripwires hooked to grenades, hidden pits, rigged artillery shells buried just beneath the surface. They didn't need tanks. They had patience, and they knew Americans would eventually go home. But how did they move so freely? How did they strike from nowhere? The answer lay underground. The Viet Cong built a vast network of tunnel systems, some stretching for miles. These weren't just escape routes. They were underground cities. Tunnels had meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, weapon storage, kitchens, and even makeshift hospitals. Fighters could disappear underground and emerge days later, somewhere else entirely. In places like Cu Chi, the tunnels ran like veins beneath the jungle. Some were barely wide enough to crawl through. Others were booby-trapped to kill intruders. And they were hot, claustrophobic, full of snakes, rats, bats. To fight back, the US created tunnel rat teams, small soldiers who volunteered to crawl inside with only a flashlight and a pistol. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Every step could trigger a trap. Every corner might hide an ambush. It was a war under the war and above ground. It wasn't any clearer, because while some villages supported the US and South Vietnamese government, many didn't. Some hated both sides. Others were simply trying to survive. The US tried to win support through programs like Hearts and Minds, building schools, roads, hospitals. But these efforts were often undercut by the violence of war itself. If a village was suspected of helping the Viet Cong, it could be bombed, burned, emptied. Sometimes entire villages were relocated to strategic hamlets, barbed wire compounds meant to separate civilians from the enemy. But this only built resentment. People were taken from their ancestral land, their traditions, their rice fields. They felt like prisoners, not protected, but punished. And when US troops swept through the countryside on search and destroy missions, things often got worse. Imagine being a young American, 19 or 20 years old, dropped into a place you don't understand, told to hunt an enemy you can't see, and then watching your friends die from traps, snipers, or landmines. You stop trusting the locals. You start seeing every farmer as a threat, every child as a possible bomber. Fear turns into anger, and sometimes that anger led to tragic consequences. There were civilian casualties, innocent lives caught in the crossfire, homes destroyed, families broken apart. For every real Viet Cong killed, many more innocents suffered. This blurred the lines between good and evil, between us and them, and that moral fog and that creeping doubt became a weight on every soldier's shoulders. Because even when they won a firefight, what had they really achieved? The enemy would return. The village would be rebuilt. The war and still unwinnable. In some areas, entire forests were destroyed using chemicals like Agent Orange, a defoliant sprayed from planes to remove jungle cover. But it poisoned the soil. It caused cancer. It harmed civilians and American soldiers alike. The US brought overwhelming power, airstrikes, artillery, helicopters, machine guns, but the VC brought endurance. They didn't need to win every battle. They just had to outlast, to stay alive. To remind the Americans that they would never leave Vietnam on their own terms. And they were everywhere. In the tunnels, in the fields, in the villages. Sometimes even inside the South Vietnamese army. That was the nightmare. The enemy among allies. The US couldn't tell the difference between a loyal soldier and a double agent. Some South Vietnamese officers passed intelligence to the north. Some units collapsed in battle or fled under fire. It was hard to trust anyone, and the stress built up. Soldiers began to crack under pressure. They questioned the war. They questioned their orders. Some turned to drugs, others shut down emotionally. And back home in America, families started asking questions too. Why were their sons dying? Why weren't they winning? The government kept saying things were going well. But the news from the front lines and the images on television told a different story. Bodies, villages in flames, helicopters lifting off with the wounded. This wasn't a clean war, this was a nightmare, and it wasn't getting better. The Viet Cong didn't need big wins. Their goal was simple: survive and exhaust. Make the war so painful, so morally unclear, so politically unpopular that the US would eventually walk away. And piece by piece, they were succeeding. Because in the war of shadows, every bullet, every bomb, every mistake became a tool in the fight for hearts and minds, not just in Vietnam, but back in the United States. The jungle wasn't the only battleground anymore. The war was being fought in the minds of soldiers, the halls of Congress, and the living rooms of American families. And while the US had the hardware, the Viet Cong had history, patience, and the power of the unknown. They could be anyone. They could be anywhere. And that, more than anything else, made this war so terrifying. It wasn't just about who had more guns, it was about who could hold out longer in the dark. Chapter 8. Operation Rolling Thunder. The jungle was thick, the enemy was hidden, and the ground war, it wasn't working. So in 1965, the United States looked to the skies. They wanted to crush North Vietnam's will to fight. They wanted to destroy supply lines, break morale, and force Ho Chi Minh to give up. They thought bombs could do what bullets hadn't, and so began one of the most intense and controversial bombing campaigns in history. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It lasted from 1965 to 1968. But it was never meant to go on that long. At first, it seemed like a show of power, a warning, a signal to North Vietnam: stop supporting the Viet Cong or suffer the consequences. But it didn't go as planned. The goal was to bomb key targets in North Vietnam, military bases, supply routes, bridges, factories, but the strategy was cautious, too cautious. President Lyndon B. Johnson and his advisors didn't want to provoke China or the Soviet Union into joining the war, so every target had to be approved in Washington. Sometimes even by LBJ himself. It was a slow, controlled campaign, but war doesn't wait. North Vietnam had time to prepare. They spread out their supplies, they hid weapons, they rebuilt roads and bridges overnight, and they got help: Soviet radar systems, anti-aircraft, guns and surface-to-air missiles. The US bombers flew again and again. But the enemy adapted. And the damage wasn't just military. Entire villages were caught in the blast zones. Civilians were injured. Schools, hospitals, and homes were destroyed. Not always on purpose, but the result was the same. For the people, on the ground, the sky became their enemy. Every time they heard the roar of jet engines overhead, they didn't know what would happen next. It wasn't just bombs. It was fire. The US began using napalm, a jellied gasoline that stuck to skin and burned at thousands of degrees. It wasn't a precision weapon. It spread, it consumed, it killed indiscriminately. Napalm bombs were dropped to clear forests and attack enemy hideouts, but they often landed on villages. It left behind charred bodies, scorched earth, and horror that couldn't be forgotten. One photo of a young Vietnamese girl running naked down a road, her skin burning from napalm, shocked the world. Her name was Phan Thi Kim Phuc, and her image became a symbol of the war's brutality. Then came Agent Orange. It was a chemical defoliant designed to strip the jungle bare, expose the enemy, and destroy crops that fed the Viet Cong. Planes sprayed it across thousands of square miles. It killed plants, it poisoned soil, and it left behind a legacy of suffering. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a toxic compound linked to cancer, birth defects, and other health problems. It didn't just affect the Vietnamese. American soldiers who handled the chemical began getting sick. Decades later, their children were born with abnormalities. The cost of this chemical war was still being paid long after the last bomb fell. Back in Washington, Operation Rolling Thunder was becoming a political mess. The military wanted more: freedom to target key locations, like ports and airfields in the north. But the White House refused. They were afraid of escalation, so they limited the campaign, and in doing so, limited its impact. Pilots were frustrated. They risked their lives flying into well-defended areas, only to be told they couldn't strike the most important targets. Meanwhile, North Vietnam was building a reputation. Despite all the bombing, they didn't surrender. They didn't slow down. In fact, their resolve hardened. They used propaganda to turn the air war into a recruiting tool. Every bomb that hit a village, another reason to fight. Every child injured by napalm, more hatred for America. The Viet Cong in the south only grew, stronger. Supplies continued to flow down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of paths, tunnels, and roads that wound through Laos and Cambodia. The US bombed the trail heavily, but the Vietnamese rebuilt it faster than it could be destroyed. They moved at night. They used bicycles reinforced with wood. They dug storage bunkers into mountainsides. They turned nature into their greatest weapon. The more the US bombed, the more determined they became. By late 1967, after nearly 3 years of bombing, the results were clear. Operation Rolling Thunder had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all the bombs dropped during World War II, combined. But the strategic impact was limited. The North hadn't collapsed. The war hadn't ended. And support at home in America was fading. Television brought the war into people's living rooms. They saw the burned villages, the terrified children, the wounded soldiers, and they asked, why? Why was America dropping so many bombs on such a small country? Why were innocent people dying? Why wasn't it working? Even inside the US government, officials began to question the campaign. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, once a firm supporter of the air war, changed his mind. He saw the strategy wasn't working. He saw the human cost, and he began to doubt everything. He would later say, "We were wrong, terribly wrong." By 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder was winding down. It had cost billions of dollars. Over 900 American aircraft had been lost. Hundreds of pilots had been killed or captured. And still, no victory. In March of that year, after the shock of the Tet Offensive, President Johnson made a major announcement. He would halt most of the bombing of North Vietnam, and he wouldn't run for re-election. It was a turning point. Operation. Rolling Thunder had begun as a symbol of American strength, but it ended as a symbol of confusion, frustration, and the limits of power. It showed that technology and firepower couldn't solve everything. That sometimes the harder you hit, the more you push people away, and it revealed something deeper. This wasn't just a military war. It was a political war, a psychological war, a war for hearts and minds, and bombing from above couldn't win it. The jungles were still thick, the enemy was still hidden, and the war was far from over. Next, the fight would move back to the ground, to the cities, to the villages, to the people themselves, and what happened next would shake the entire world. Chapter 9. Westmoreland's War. The bombs had fallen, the skies had thundered, but victory didn't come. As Operation Rolling Thunder lost momentum, the focus shifted back to the ground, and leading that ground war was one man. General William. Westmoreland, tall, confident, and always in uniform, Westmoreland became the face of America's war in Vietnam. He believed the U.S. could win, not by holding territory, not by winning hearts and minds, but by killing the enemy. As many as possible. To him, success wasn't about land. It was about body counts. The idea was simple, at least on paper. The U.S. had more men, more firepower, and more money, so if they could kill enough North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong fighters, eventually the enemy would run out of people. They'd be forced to give up. This became known as the War of Attrition, grinding the enemy down one body at a time, and Westmoreland's preferred tactic? Search and destroy. U.S. troops would be flown or trucked into hostile territory. They'd sweep through villages, jungles, and rice paddies, looking for enemy forces. When they found them, they'd call in artillery, helicopters, or airstrikes to destroy them. Then they'd leave. No attempt to hold ground, no attempt to stay in those villages. Just kill and move on. It made sense to the generals in Washington, but on the ground, it was chaos. The enemy didn't fight fair. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't gather in big groups. They used ambushes, booby traps, and tunnels. Sometimes a quiet-looking village would suddenly erupt with gunfire. Other times, soldiers would walk into the jungle and never walk back out. And when they did find someone to fight, it wasn't always the enemy. Villagers were caught in the crossfire. Entire communities were burned because someone thought they were helping the Viet Cong. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't, but the U.S. strategy didn't leave much room for questions. Soldiers were told to go in hard, leave fast, and count the bodies. That became the metric of success. Not victories, not territory, not peace, but how many enemy troops were killed. After each mission, commanders would report the number of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers killed. The higher the number, the better. But here's the problem. No one really knew how many of the dead were actually enemy fighters, villagers, women, even children. Sometimes they were counted too. Some reports were exaggerated, some were simply wrong. And slowly a dark truth started to spread among the troops. If you couldn't find enough Viet Cong, you just made the numbers look better. It wasn't official policy, but it happened. And back home, those inflated numbers gave the illusion of progress. General Westmoreland told Congress and the American people that the U.S. was winning, that victory was near, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But for the soldiers on the ground, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like mud, fear, exhaustion, and confusion. They'd clear a village, kill a few fighters, maybe lose a man or two, then move on. A few days later, the enemy was back in the same village. It was like fighting a ghost that kept coming back. Westmoreland kept asking for more troops. By 1967, over 400,000 U.S. soldiers were in Vietnam. By 1968, that number would climb to over 500,000. But more soldiers didn't mean more success. Many were drafted teenagers fresh out of high school, thrown into a jungle war they didn't understand, in a country they'd never heard of. Morale started to drop. Drugs, alcohol, and even insubordination became common. Some soldiers began to doubt the mission. Others just wanted to survive there, tour and go home. For the Vietnamese people, this strategy was devastating. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were often burned, entire families displaced, rice fields destroyed, water buffalo shot, and the enemy took advantage. The Viet Cong used the damage caused by US forces as proof that America wasn't liberating Vietnam. They were destroying it, the North. Vietnamese broadcast messages over radio. They printed leaflets. They used every civilian death as fuel for their cause, and it worked. Even some South Vietnamese began to quietly support the other side. Meanwhile, in America, the war was getting harder to defend. Journalists embedded with soldiers saw the destruction firsthand. They reported the horrors of napalm, the dead children, the burning homes. They questioned the body counts. They asked, what are we actually achieving here? And when the numbers didn't match the reality, trust began to erode. Still, Westmoreland insisted the war was going well, that the enemy was being worn down, that just a little more time and a few more troops, and it would all pay off. But that wasn't true. The North Vietnamese weren't giving up. The Viet Cong weren't running out of fighters. And while America was chasing body counts, the enemy was planning something much bigger, a surprise, a shock. That would change everything. But before we get there, we need to understand why Westmoreland stuck to this strategy for so long. He was a traditional soldier, a World War II veteran. He believed in numbers, in charts, in math. He thought if you killed more enemies than they killed of you, you were winning. But Vietnam didn't follow that logic. The enemy wasn't counting bodies. They were counting time. They believed if they held out long enough, the American public would turn against the war. And that's exactly what started to happen. Protests back home grew louder. Parents wanted their sons back. Students marched in the streets. People watched the nightly news and saw no end in sight. And when soldiers returned home, they didn't get parades. They got silence, or worse, judgment. Westmoreland still believed in victory, but the war was slipping through his fingers. The enemy had one last card to play, a massive, coordinated attack that would shatter the illusion of American control. That moment would arrive in the next chapter. But for now, as 1967 ended, Westmoreland stood before the cameras and reporters with calm confidence. He said the war was nearly won. He was wrong. The next attack would prove it, and the entire world would watch it unfold in real time. Chapter 10. The World Watches. As the jungles of Vietnam burned and American soldiers marched through rice paddies, the world was not just watching, it was reacting. From Moscow to Beijing, from Paris to New Delhi, from London to Tokyo, the Vietnam War was not just a local conflict anymore. It had become a global crisis, a symbol, a warning, a wound, and it was playing out live, in newspapers, on televisions, and in protests echoing through city streets around the world. The Cold War was already dividing the world. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense standoff, each side trying to gain influence in every corner of the globe. To Washington, Vietnam was about stopping communism. To Moscow and Beijing, Vietnam was something else. It was a chance to bleed American power. Let's start with the Soviet Union. From the early days of the war, the USSR saw North Vietnam as a valuable ally in Southeast Asia. A communist regime resisting Western imperialism? That was exactly the kind of fight the Soviets loved to support. So they sent weapons, thousands of rifles, machine guns, and rockets. They sent anti-aircraft systems to shoot down American planes. They provided MiG fighter jets, radar systems, and even trained North Vietnamese pilots and technicians. But it wasn't just about the hardware. Soviet advisors helped build underground bunkers. They taught North Vietnamese forces how to jam American communications. They even provided fuel, trucks, and spare parts. And all of this was done quietly, behind the scenes. The Soviet Union didn't want a direct war with America, but they were more than happy to fund a war against America. In total, the Soviets sent billions of dollars worth of aid to North Vietnam. But they weren't the only ones. China also stepped in. At first, relations between China and North Vietnam were close. Both were communist countries. Both had fought colonial powers, and both saw the United States as a common enemy. Chairman Mao Zedong believed helping North Vietnam was a way to challenge American influence near China's borders. So China sent hundreds of thousands of support troops, not for combat but for logistics. They built roads, railways, and anti-air defenses. They repaired bridges and kept supply lines moving. They sent food, ammunition, and medical supplies. For North Vietnam, Chinese support was crucial in the early years, but there was tension too, as well. The 1960s progressed. China and the Soviet Union began to argue over who was the true leader of the communist world. This split, known as the Sino-Soviet split, affected North Vietnam deeply. Both powers still supported the war, but they began to compete for influence in Hanoi. North Vietnam, meanwhile, tried to play both sides, accepting aid from both Moscow and Beijing, but refusing to fully align with either. It was a delicate game. And it worked. Thanks to Soviet and Chinese support, North Vietnam had enough firepower, training, and supplies to keep fighting, year after year. But while governments sent aid, the people of the world were starting to lose patience, especially in the West. Let's talk about Europe. In places like France, West Germany, and the United Kingdom, many people saw the Vietnam War not as a noble cause, but as an extension of colonialism. France especially had its own scars. After all, France had colonized Vietnam for nearly a century. They'd fought and lost at Dien Bien Phu. Now, watching. America's step in to try and fix Vietnam felt like déjà vu, and not in a good way. In Paris, protests erupted. Students filled the streets chanting anti-war slogans. Intellectuals published books and articles criticizing U.S. actions. Some even traveled to North Vietnam in solidarity. One of the most famous figures, Jean-Paul Sartre, called the war a crime and accused the U.S. of spreading suffering under the excuse of freedom. In West Germany, students who had grown up in the shadow of Nazi guilt now questioned American power and military violence. Demonstrations grew, police clashed with protesters. A new generation was waking up and rejecting blind loyalty to any superpower. Even in Canada, traditionally close to the U.S., many people opposed the war. Canada officially stayed out, but Canadian hospitals treated wounded American soldiers. At the same time, thousands of young American men crossed the border to avoid being drafted. And then there was Japan. Still recovering from World War II, Japan had rebuilt itself as a close U.S. ally. But the war in Vietnam troubled many Japanese citizens. They feared that their country would be dragged into another conflict. Anti-war marches grew larger, especially among students and workers. Meanwhile, in India, a newly independent country with its own struggles, many leaders and thinkers condemned the war. They saw it as a clash between imperialism and self-determination. Even in Africa and Latin America, where countries were fighting their own battles for freedom and identity, people watched the Vietnam War closely. Many saw the Vietnamese as heroes, tiny but defiant, standing up to a giant. But perhaps the most important global reaction came from within the United States itself. As footage of the war appeared on nightly news, burning villages, wounded, soldiers crying children, Americans began to question everything. College campuses exploded with protests. Draft cards were burned, songs were written, flags were waved and burned. Some Americans believed the war was necessary, that communism had to be stopped. But more and more believed something else, that the U.S. had no business in Vietnam, that too many lives were being lost for a war no one truly understood. The global anti-war movement gained strength. In London, Rome, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, crowds marched in the streets, demanding an end to the violence. In Stockholm, students occupied U.S. embassies. In Australia, a key U.S. ally, opposition grew louder. Families began to question why their sons were being sent to die in a war so far from home. Across the globe, the Vietnam War had become more than just a fight in Southeast Asia. It had become a symbol of resistance, of injustice, of lost faith in power. But what did this mean for the war itself? Well, on one level, not much. The bombs still fell, the soldiers still fought. The body count kept rising, but on another level, a deeper one, it meant everything. The United States wasn't just fighting a war in Vietnam, it was fighting a war of perception around the world, and it was losing that war. When allies question your purpose, when your own people march against your choices, when your enemy is backed by two global powers, winning becomes much harder. And for the North Vietnamese, this global reaction was a gift. They used it in propaganda. They showed images of global protests to their soldiers. They said, "Look, the world is on our side." And often, they were right. As the war dragged on, America stood more and more isolated, fewer allies, more criticism, and no easy way out. The world was watching. And what they saw was not strength. It was confusion, violence, uncertainty. And soon that uncertainty would explode into the most shocking moment of the entire war, a moment that would shake America to its core. But for now, as the war entered its next phase, one thing was clear. The war in Vietnam was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about the world, and the world was watching. Chapter 11. Life and Death in the Jungle. The world was watching, yes, but in the thick of the jungle there were no cameras, no protests, no speeches, only the heat, the silence, the sound of your own breath, and the question every soldier asked, every single day, "Am I going to die today?" This was the war from the inside, the personal, brutal, day-to-day life of the men sent to fight it. Not generals, not presidents, just boys, young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, from Chicago, from Georgia, from Iowa, from Harlem, dropped into a world they didn't understand. Some volunteered, most didn't. Some believed in the mission. Many didn't even know what the mission really was. What they knew was this: they were in Vietnam, and it was hell. It wasn't like any war America had fought before. There were no front lines, no battle maps that made sense, just thick jungle, mud, insects, heat so intense it melted your will to fight. And the enemy? You couldn't see them. They were ghosts. They could be farmers by day and ambushers by night. They knew every trail, every tree, every tunnel. You could walk right into a trap and never know it until the jungle exploded around you. Many US soldiers arrived expecting something heroic. Instead, they found something surreal. They didn't march into towns waving flags. They were choppered into landing zones, hearts pounding, unsure what waited below. Sometimes the LZ was quiet. Other times it was a hot zone, and bullets rained. Like a storm before boots even touched ground. They'd leap into tall elephant grass, bullets snapping overhead, friends screaming for medics. You'd return fire at shadows. You didn't know if you hit anything, you just kept shooting, just kept moving. Many days were spent patrolling, long, endless walks in the heat, 60-pound packs, wet socks, traps everywhere. The Viet Cong had 1,000 ways to kill you without ever showing their faces. Punji traps, sharpened bamboo sticks coated in excrement, hidden under leaves. Step in the wrong spot, and you weren't just wounded, you were infected. Booby traps, grenades wired to trees, tripwires stretched across jungle trails, even explosives hidden in soda cans. The jungle wasn't just a battlefield, it was alive. And it wanted to kill you, and it wasn't just the enemy you fought. You fought the jungle itself, snakes, mosquitoes, leeches, malaria, dengue, skin infections that turned your feet into raw meat. No sleep, no clean clothes, no showers. It rained hard, sometimes for weeks. You'd be soaked all day, then freeze at night. You'd go on patrol soaked in mud, come back to base, maybe eat some cold rations, then sleep on the floor with rats crawling over your pack. But the worst part? The waiting. You'd walk for hours and find nothing. You'd sit in silence for days. Then boom, an ambush, screams, smoke, gunfire. And in less than a minute, it was over. One of the soldiers who survived said, "The worst wasn't the firefight. It was what came next, the quiet. You didn't know who was dead, or where the next bullet might come from. You didn't just fear death, you feared not knowing. Every bush was a threat. Every shadow could kill you. You slept with your rifle, you kept the safety off, you never let your boots off because if you had to run in the night, you'd die barefoot. And yet, somehow, in all that terror, something else grew. Brotherhood. It's strange. In a place designed to break the human spirit, soldiers found something unbreakable. Not patriotism, not politics, not ideology. They found each other. You didn't fight for your country. You fought for the guy next to you, the one who handed you a cigarette after patrol, the one who covered you with his body when the mortar hit, the one who shared his last water bottle when yours ran out, and when he died, when his body was zipped up and chopped out. It tore a hole inside you that never closed. There were moments, in between the chaos, that stayed with them forever, like a patrol through quiet jungle when birds returned after gunfire, or a game of cards in a hooch made of sandbags, or a letter from home that smelled like perfume. Some of them wrote back. Some didn't. Some never made it back at all. But the war didn't just wound the body, it scarred the mind. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't even a term back then, but the symptoms were everywhere. Soldiers couldn't sleep. They jumped at loud noises. They couldn't forget the smell of burning. They couldn't stop hearing the cries of wounded friends. Many came home physically intact, but emotionally shattered. They'd try to blend back into American life. But how do you explain to someone what it's like to carry a friend's body to a chopper? To kill someone who looked like a farmer, only to find they had a grenade under their shirt? How do you tell your family that you're afraid of silence? Because that's when the ambushes always came. The pain didn't stop when the tour ended. For many, it never stopped. Drugs, alcohol, violence, depression, it became a part of daily life for countless Vietnam vets. And for too long, America didn't want to hear their stories, didn't want to see their scars, didn't want to admit that this war had broken its own soldiers. But inside every man who served was a story. Some told theirs, some buried it. Some took it with them to the grave. One soldier wrote years later, "We weren't heroes, we weren't villains, we were just kids, sent to do a job no one understood, in a war no one wanted to win." And maybe that's the deepest wound of all, because in war there's always trauma. But in Vietnam there was confusion too, no clear purpose, no clear end, and yet those men, those boys, still did their duty, not because they wanted to, because they had to. They survived the jungle, the traps, the fear, the death. They survived when others didn't. And though they were never welcomed like the soldiers of World War II, though parades didn't greet them when they came home, though many suffered in silence, their story matters, because the story of Vietnam is not just about politicians or maps. It's about the humans who walked through hell with mud on their boots and rifles in their hands. It's about the pain they carried, the friendships they forged, the innocence they lost, and the truth they left behind. Chapter 12. The Tet Offensive. They say some battles aren't just fought with bullets. Some are fought with perception, with shock, with timing, and with the power to change how people see the war. The Tet Offensive was one of those battles. It didn't win ground. It didn't crush the US military. But it crushed something bigger, the illusion that America was winning. It began in early 1968. The war had already been dragging on for years. US troop numbers had surged past 500,000, and General Westmoreland was confident. He told the press, the president, and the American people that victory was just around the corner, that the enemy was weakening, that the war was nearly over. But in Hanoi, the leadership of North Vietnam was thinking very differently. They were planning something bold, risky, massive. They called it a general offensive, an uprising. The plan? Hit South Vietnam with everything they had, everywhere, all at once. They hoped the South Vietnamese people would rise up and join them, that the Americans would be caught off guard, that maybe, just maybe, they could end the war in one shocking blow. But the real genius of the Tet Offensive was when they planned it. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's the most important holiday in Vietnam. A time of family, rest, and tradition. Normally, both sides in the war would call an informal ceasefire during Tet, but this time, North Vietnam broke the rules. In the early hours of January 30th, 1968, just as celebrations were starting, the attacks began. It wasn't just one city. It wasn't just a surprise raid. It was everywhere. More than 100 cities, military bases, and outposts across South Vietnam were hit simultaneously, a coordinated attack the US and South Vietnamese never saw coming. In Saigon, the capital, explosions rocked the city. Gunfire echoed in the streets. Even the US Embassy, the most heavily guarded building in the city, came under attack. A small team of Viet Cong commandos blew a hole in the wall and stormed the compound. They were eventually killed, but the image was burned into people's minds. If the US Embassy could be hit, was anywhere really safe? Elsewhere in Hue, a historic city near the DMZ, one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war began. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army took over large parts of the city. For nearly a month, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops fought house by house, block by block. When the battle ended, Hue was devastated. Thousands of civilians had died. And as the fog of war cleared, something even darker emerged: mass. Graves over 2,800 South Vietnamese civilians had been executed by communist forces during the occupation. City officials, teachers, doctors, even monks. It was one of the worst atrocities of the war. In military terms, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for North Vietnam. They didn't hold the cities. They didn't cause a mass uprising. They lost tens of thousands of fighters, many of them irreplaceable. But that didn't matter. Because the real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the living rooms of America. The attacks were broadcast on TV screens across the United States. Families watching the nightly news saw chaos in Saigon, smoke rising from embassies, soldiers dragged out of buildings, civilians running in panic, and they asked themselves, "I thought we were winning." Even though U.S. forces pushed the attackers back, even though the Viet Cong were crippled, public opinion shifted. Americans no longer believed what they were being told. If the enemy could launch an attack like this after all these years, after all those promises, then maybe this war couldn't be won. One of the most respected news anchors in America, Walter Cronkite, traveled to Vietnam just after Tet. He saw the destruction firsthand. When he returned home, he went on air and said something shocking. "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge." That line hit hard. President Lyndon B. Johnson, watching from the White House, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And in many ways he had. Support for the war plummeted. Protests surged. The credibility of the government was shattered. LBJ's approval ratings nosedived. And just weeks after Tet, in a surprise announcement, he told the nation he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive broke his presidency. It also changed the entire direction of the war. General Westmoreland, who had been asking for 200,000 more troops, was replaced. A new approach emerged. Less about winning outright, more about finding a way out. It was the beginning of something called Vietnamization, letting South Vietnamese forces take over more of the fighting while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. But for now the war raged on, and the irony? While the Viet Cong were nearly wiped out in the Tet Offensive, their spirit became stronger than ever, because the people they wanted to reach weren't just in Vietnam. They were in America, and with just one daring offensive they planted a seed of doubt that would grow and grow, until it couldn't be ignored. Tet wasn't just a turning point. It was a psychological earthquake. It didn't end the war. But it changed it. It made Americans ask questions they hadn't asked before. Why are we really here? What are we fighting for? And at what cost? The men in the jungle still fought, still died, but something had shifted, and once the minds of a nation began to change, the rest would follow. Chapter 13. The War at Home. As the jungles of Vietnam burned, so too did the streets of America. The war, once sold as a noble fight against communism, had come home. Not with guns or napalm, but with picket signs, chants, tear gas, and fury. The Tet Offensive had shaken America's belief in victory, but what came next was something deeper. It wasn't just doubt in the war, it was anger. Anger at the government, anger at the lies, anger at a system that seemed to sacrifice young men by the thousands for a cause fewer and fewer people believed. This wasn't a war just being fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was now a war being fought in college campuses, courtrooms, kitchens, and on the evening news, and it tore the country in half. At the center of it all was the draft, a system that pulled young American men into the military, whether they wanted to go or not. At first, the draft was seen as just another part of wartime. But by the late 1960s, things had changed. Many began to question, why were working-class boys being sent to die while the rich and powerful found ways to avoid service? Why were black Americans expected to fight for freedom abroad when they didn't have full freedom at home? Why were people being forced to fight a war they didn't believe in? Protesters weren't just speaking out. They were refusing. They burned their draft cards in public. They chained themselves to recruiting stations. They sat in university halls and shouted in the faces of generals. And when the police came, they didn't run. They resisted, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with fists. By 1968, the anti-war movement had exploded. College campuses became battlegrounds. Students at places like Berkeley, Columbia, and Kent State weren't just skipping class. They were taking over buildings, demanding their schools cut ties with the military, demanding their voices be heard. In Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands of Americans marched on the Capitol. They held signs that read, "Hell no, we won't go," and "Bring the boys home." They flooded the National Mall with chants of "Stop the war." Sometimes they sang, sometimes they clashed with police, but always they made noise. And it wasn't just students, veterans, men who had fought in the jungles and seen the horror firsthand, began speaking out. In 1971, a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War gathered in D.C. They held a powerful protest called Dewey Canyon the Three. One by one, they stood before the Capitol and threw their medals, the same medals they'd bled for, onto the steps. Some shouted, some cried. They said they were done being used. This war, they said, wasn't about honor anymore. It was about lies. And while the war raged overseas, America was dealing with another fire, the civil rights movement. The Vietnam War and civil rights weren't separate. They were deeply connected. Black leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began to speak out not just against racism, but against the war. In 1967, King delivered a powerful speech, Beyond Vietnam. He called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He asked, "How can we send poor black boys to fight and die in Southeast Asia while they still live in poverty and injustice here at home?" That speech cost him. Some supporters turned against him. The White House distanced itself, but King didn't back down. Soon, others joined in. Muhammad Ali, the world heavyweight boxing champion, made headlines when he refused to be drafted. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he said. For that, he was stripped of his title. He was banned from boxing. He faced prison. But he became a symbol for courage, for resistance, for standing up to a war you didn't believe in. And yet, not everyone was against the war. America was deeply divided. For every protester there was someone waving the flag, someone who believed in the war, someone who thought the protesters were unpatriotic or even traitors. They called them hippies, draft dodgers, and worse. This wasn't just a political split. It was generational, cultural, emotional. Fathers argued with sons. Friends stopped speaking. Neighborhoods divided. Some families never recovered. In 1969, something terrifying happened. Richard Nixon had just become president, promising to end the war with honor. But instead, he secretly expanded the war into Cambodia. When the news leaked, protests exploded again. At Kent State University in Ohio, students gathered to protest the expansion. On May 4, 1970, the National Guard was sent to control the crowd. What happened next shocked the nation. Guardsmen opened fire. 13 seconds, 67 bullets, 4 students dead, 9 wounded. One was just walking to class. One was an ROTC student. None were armed. Photos of the aftermath went around the world. One of a young woman kneeling beside a dead body screaming in horror became iconic. And suddenly people who had never joined a protest before were asking, "How did we get here?" The Kent State shootings sparked even more outrage. Over 4 million students across the country went on strike. Hundreds of colleges shut down. America wasn't just protesting a war, it was at war with itself. Meanwhile, Nixon pushed back hard. He called the protesters bums. He said the silent majority of Americans still supported the war, and him. But that silence was breaking. Even inside the military, morale was collapsing. Some U.S. troops refused orders. Some sabotaged equipment. There were even cases of fragging, soldiers throwing grenades into their own officers' tents. The war had created a deep moral crisis, not just in politics, not just on the streets, but inside the very people sent to fight. The trust between the American people and their government was broken, and then came one final blow, the Pentagon Papers. In 1971, a former government analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked thousands of secret documents to the press. The papers showed that U.S. officials had lied. For years, they had misled the public about how the war was going. They knew early on that victory was unlikely. They knew about secret bombings. They knew, and they kept sending young men to die anyway. The public was furious. The credibility of the U.S. government crumbled. People no longer believed. And without belief, wars become very hard to fight. By now America was tired, wounded, divided. The protests had grown so loud, so powerful, they could no longer be ignored. And slowly, step by step, the war began to wind down. But the scars at home would last just as long, maybe even longer than the ones left in Vietnam. The Vietnam War didn't just shape a generation of soldiers, it shaped a generation of Americans who questioned their leaders, their history, and their future. Fighting in Vietnam would continue for a few more years, but back home, the war had already changed everything. Chapter 14: Secrets and Scandals. The war had already taken its toll on the jungles of Vietnam and the soul of America. But in the early 1970s, the war took a darker turn, not because of what was happening on the battlefield, but because of what people were discovering back home. Secrets, lies, cover-ups, crimes, not by enemies but by their own government and military. What the public thought they knew about. Vietnam was about to be torn apart. First came the story of My Lai. It happened on March 16, 1968, a small village in South Vietnam, mostly women, children, and elderly farmers. Just another dot on the map in the endless countryside. But that day, a group of U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, young, angry, exhausted, entered the village on a search-and-destroy mission. They had been told the village was full of Viet Cong, but there were no enemy fighters, no weapons, no threat. Still, what followed was not a mistake. It was a massacre. The soldiers rounded up unarmed civilians. They shot them. They raped women. They killed children. They burned homes. More than 500 people, most of them women and children, were slaughtered, and the world would have never known. If not for a helicopter crew, a pilot named Hugh Thompson saw what was happening from the air. He landed his chopper between the villagers and the soldiers and threatened to fire on his own men if they didn't stop. Thompson and his crew saved a handful of lives that day. But the damage was done. After the massacre, the army tried to bury it. Reports were falsified. Files were hidden. The story was swept under the rug, but one young soldier, Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard what happened from fellow troops, couldn't forget. He wrote letters to Congress, the Pentagon, and the media. It took over a year, but eventually, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in late 1969. The photos were horrifying. Bodies stacked in ditches, children lying face down in blood-soaked clothes. The American public was shocked. They had been told the U.S. military was defending freedom, protecting the innocent. Now they saw something else. Only one man, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, then released after just 3 years under house arrest. Many were outraged. Some still defended him, but no one could deny what had happened. My Lai shattered the idea that America was always the hero, and just when people thought they had seen the worst, more truth leaked out. In 1971, a former military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg walked into the offices of the New York Times with a stack of classified documents. It was a bombshell. Thousands of pages of internal government reports, secret memos, military assessments and intelligence briefings about the Vietnam War going back to the 1950s. These were the Pentagon Papers. What they revealed was devastating. For years, American leaders, from President Truman to Johnson, had lied. They had misled the public about the war's purpose, the progress, and the possibility of winning. Even as they told the American people that victory was near, they knew privately it was unlikely. They knew the war would drag on. They knew more lives would be lost. They kept sending troops anyway. The papers showed that the war wasn't just a tragedy, it was a calculated deception. When the New York Times published the first stories, the government struck back. The Nixon administration demanded the articles be stopped. They took the newspaper to court, arguing national security was at risk, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press. In a landmark decision, they said freedom of the press must come first. Now the Pentagon Papers were public, and the damage was done. Millions of Americans felt betrayed. They began to question everything, not just the war, but the very system that had brought them into it. Nixon, furious, saw Ellsberg as a national threat. He wanted him destroyed. Behind the scenes, he created a group of operatives called the Plumbers. Their job, discredit Ellsberg and stop future leaks. They broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist looking for dirt. They tapped phones. They crossed legal lines, and those illegal actions would later explode into another scandal, Watergate. But that's another story. Right now, the war in Vietnam was still raging. But at home, trust in the government was collapsing. People weren't just protesting anymore. They were disillusioned. Parents didn't believe what generals said. Soldiers didn't believe what their commanders told them. Reporters didn't trust the Pentagon. And for many Americans, the real enemy was no longer in Vietnam. It was in Washington. These scandals weren't just news stories. They became symbols. My Lai symbolized the moral breakdown of the war. The Pentagon Papers symbolized the political betrayal, and the impact was enormous. Recruitment numbers fell. Draft dodging increased. Congress, embarrassed and angry, started pushing back. By the end of 1971, it was clear the war had lost its support, not because of a military defeat, but because of a crisis of truth. How could a nation fight if it no longer believed the reasons it had gone to war? Even Nixon, who had once promised a secret plan to end the war, was now trapped. He escalated the bombing campaign. He tried to negotiate peace, but the scandals weakened his position. America wanted out, but didn't know how to leave without admitting defeat. Meanwhile, veterans kept returning home, but they didn't come back to parades or celebrations. They came back to a country that didn't understand what they'd been through. Some were called baby killers. Some were ignored entirely. Many carried invisible wounds, trauma, guilt, confusion. Some couldn't hold jobs. Some couldn't sleep. Some ended their own lives. The war hadn't just broken a country overseas. It had broken its own people. And now, with secrets exposed and faith destroyed, the war entered its final brutal chapters. But not before one last surge of bombing, one last wave of negotiations, and one more desperate attempt to claim something. That looked like victory. The end was coming, but not yet. And in the shadows of every helicopter, behind every official speech, one question kept echoing. How did it come to this? Chapter 15. Vietnamization Begins. After years of bloodshed and scandal, the United States faced a problem it couldn't ignore. The war in Vietnam wasn't ending, and the American people had had enough. In 1969, Richard Nixon stood before the country as the new president. He had a promise, peace with honor. But what did that really mean? To many, it sounded like a way out. To others, it was just more words. In truth, Nixon knew he couldn't win the war outright, but he didn't want to be the first U.S. president to lose a war either. So he came up with a new plan, Vietnamization, a long word for a simple idea. Let the South Vietnamese take over the fighting, while the Americans slowly pulled out. On paper, it sounded perfect. Less U.S. involvement, more responsibility for South Vietnam. A clean exit. But in reality, nothing about it was clean, because while Nixon talked about peace, he was also widening the war in secret. Let's break it down. When Nixon took office, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. The war had become a political nightmare, and the scandals, My Lai, the Pentagon Papers, had shattered trust in the mission. At Cries, home anti-war protests were growing louder. College campuses, veterans, even politicians. The country was on edge. Nixon knew that pulling out overnight would lead to chaos, so he started a gradual withdrawal of American troops. At the same time, he increased military aid to South Vietnam. Guns, helicopters, training, money, everything they'd need to stand on their own. The South Vietnamese Army, known as the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, would become the main force fighting the communists. But there was a problem. The ARVN had been built under the protection of American troops. Many soldiers lacked training, morale, and leadership. Corruption was rampant, desertions were rising. And the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were still strong. Nixon believed if he gave the ARVN time, they'd be able to hold the line. So, while he began pulling troops out, he looked for a way to weaken the enemy quickly. That's where things got darker. North Vietnam wasn't just using Vietnam to fight. They were moving men and supplies through a secret route that ran through neighboring countries. Cambodia and Laos. This network was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was the lifeline of the war for the North. So Nixon decided to cut that lifeline, but instead of going through Congress or telling the American people, he did it in secret. In March 1969, Nixon launched Operation Menu, a series of secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia. B-52 bombers flew high above the jungle, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on targets suspected to be used by the Viet Cong. The bombings had code names like breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. No one in the US public knew. Even some officials in the Pentagon were kept in the dark. Why the secrecy? Because Cambodia was a neutral country. It wasn't officially involved in the war. Bombing it could have sparked international outrage, or worse. So Nixon kept it hidden. These bombings were massive. Entire villages were flattened. Tens of thousands of Cambodians were killed or displaced. And as the bombs rained down, something else happened. More and more Cambodians turned against their own government, which was already weak. This would eventually lead to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist group that would later commit genocide in Cambodia. But that's later. For now, Nixon was focused on the short-term goal, hurting North Vietnam, speeding up peace talks, and getting out. By 1970, Nixon expanded the campaign further. He sent US and South Vietnamese troops into Cambodia, trying to destroy Viet Cong bases. The invasion sparked a firestorm back home. People were furious. Students protested in every corner of the country. And then, something tragic happened. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students protesting the war. 4 students were killed, 9 were wounded. The images were seared into the national memory, students lying dead on the ground. Others screaming in disbelief. It was a turning point. Americans realized the war wasn't just in the jungles of Asia, it was tearing apart their own country. Meanwhile, Nixon tried to defend his actions. He said the bombing and invasions were necessary to pressure North Vietnam into peace. He claimed Vietnamization was working. More US troops were leaving. ARVN forces were stepping up. But behind the scenes, doubts were growing. Military commanders knew the ARVN wasn't ready. And the North Vietnamese weren't backing down. In Laos, Nixon launched another major operation in 1971, Operation Lam Son 719, an attempt by ARVN forces to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside Laos. But US ground troops were not allowed to enter Laos directly due to congressional restrictions. So the ARVN went in alone with only American air support. It was a disaster. The ARVN were ambushed, overrun, and forced to retreat. Helicopters were shot down in droves. Thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers were killed or captured. The failure exposed a harsh truth. Despite years of training and billions in aid, South Vietnam couldn't fight on its own. Vietnamization was falling apart. But Nixon kept pushing forward. Why? Because peace negotiations were happening in Paris, and Nixon believed that showing military strength through bombing and escalation would give him leverage at the table. He wanted the North to think America wasn't weak, even if it meant prolonging the war a little longer. In 1972, Nixon made one more dramatic move. He launched Operation Linebacker, a powerful bombing campaign targeting North Vietnamese cities, supply lines, and ports. This time, it wasn't secret. This was full-scale. The bombing continued into Christmas of 1972, known as the Christmas bombings, a final push to force North Vietnam to sign a peace deal. Thousands died, but the pressure worked. In January 1973, peace agreement was finally signed. The US agreed to pull out the last of its combat troops. In return, North Vietnam agreed to stop fighting for now. Nixon called it peace with honor, but most people knew the truth. It was a way out. The US had spent over a decade, billions of dollars, and thousands of lives to end up with a deal that changed very little. South Vietnam was still fragile, the North was still strong, and the war wasn't truly over. So what did Vietnamization really achieve? It bought time. It helped Nixon avoid the image of a defeated president. It gave the illusion that South Vietnam could stand on its own, but it also widened the war, dragged in neighboring countries, and left deep scars. In the end, the South Vietnamese would have to face the North alone, and in just 2 years, their fate would be sealed. But before the final collapse, there was still one more major event, a moment that would shake the world, the Fall of Saigon. Chapter 16, Cambodia and Chaos. The war in Vietnam was never just about Vietnam. It had always spilled over the borders, through the jungles, over the trails, and into countries that weren't officially part of the war. But after 1969, one neighbor, Cambodia, would be dragged in violently, and what followed would become one of the darkest chapters in Southeast Asian history. To understand how it all started, we need to go back to something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was the North Vietnamese Army's secret lifeline, winding through Laos and Cambodia to move troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. It was hidden beneath thick jungle, canopy. It couldn't be stopped by borders, and it couldn't be stopped by diplomacy. So when US President Richard Nixon launched Vietnamization, he also made a decision. If the war couldn't be won inside Vietnam, then maybe it could be fought outside it. That's when Cambodia became the next battleground. At first it was in the shadows. In 1969, Nixon began secret bombing raids inside Cambodia, targeting areas where the Viet Cong were believed to be hiding. These bombings were part of Operation Menu, with codenames like breakfast, lunch, snack, and dinner. Each raid dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on Cambodian villages, forests, and farmland. No one in the US public knew. Congress didn't know. Even most of Nixon's own administration didn't know. He kept it quiet, afraid that opening a new front in the war would cause backlash. But the truth has a way of getting out, and when the bombings were revealed, it shocked the world. Cambodia at the time was officially neutral. Its leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had tried to keep his country out of the war by playing both sides, allowing North Vietnamese troops to pass through while trying to keep peace inside his own borders. But Nixon's bombings and growing US pressure began to destabilize the fragile government. In 1970, everything changed. Sihanouk was overthrown in a coup by General Lon Nol, who took power with quiet support from the United States. Lon Nol quickly aligned himself with the West and demanded that North Vietnamese troops leave Cambodia. That was a dangerous move. The North Vietnamese responded by digging in deeper. And a brutal civil war erupted inside Cambodia. On one side was Lon Nol's Cambodian government and army, backed by the US. On the other side, a shadowy communist group called the Khmer Rouge, supported by North Vietnam. Most Americans had never even heard of them, but they would soon become infamous for something truly horrifying. The Khmer Rouge was led by a man named Pol Pot. He wasn't like other revolutionaries. He didn't just want to take power. He wanted to erase Cambodia's entire modern society and rebuild it from scratch. To do that, he believed he had to destroy everything: cities, schools, religion, money, technology, even families. It sounded impossible, unthinkable. But within 5 years, he would try to do exactly that, and millions would die because of it. As the Civil War raged, Nixon made a bold move. In April 1970, US and South Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia. They said it was a short, limited operation, just to destroy North Vietnamese supply lines. But the reality was far messier. Tens of thousands of American and ARVN soldiers crossed the border. Fierce fighting broke out. Villages were bombed. Civilians fled in panic. The invasion sparked massive protests back in the United States. People asked, if Nixon promised to end the war, why was he expanding it? The protests reached a tragic peak at Kent State University, where 4 students were shot dead during an anti-war demonstration. Back in Cambodia, the war was tearing the country apart. Lon Nol's government grew weaker and more corrupt. The Khmer Rouge grew stronger and more ruthless, and by 1973, U.S. ground troops had left Cambodia. But the bombing campaign didn't stop. From 1970 to 1973, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Cambodia than it had during all of World War II. Over 2.7 million tons of bombs. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Farms and rice fields were scorched. Tens of thousands of Cambodians were killed. Many survivors, traumatized and furious, joined the Khmer Rouge, seeing them as the only force capable of fighting back. By 1975, the war inside Cambodia reached its breaking point. Lon Nol's army collapsed, and the Khmer Rouge marched into the capital, Phnom Penh, victorious. The people at first cheered. They thought the war was finally over, but they didn't know what was coming. Within hours of taking the city, Khmer Rouge soldiers began ordering people out of their homes. "Leave the city," they said. "You'll come back soon." But no. One ever came back. Children, parents, grandparents, the sick, the elderly. Everyone was forced to march into the countryside at gunpoint. The Khmer Rouge began building their perfect society, a twisted vision of communism where cities were emptied, religion was banned, and everyone had to work in labor camps. People were forced to farm from sunrise to sunset. Speaking out meant death. Reading a book meant death. Wearing glasses could mean death, because it meant you were educated. The Khmer Rouge called this new era Year Zero. They erased history. They killed teachers, doctors, engineers, anyone who could think independently. And then they turned on their own. Purges, executions, torture, starvation. By the time it was over, more than 2 million Cambodians were dead. That's almost a quarter of the entire population. It was one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, and it all began in part because the Vietnam War spilled over into Cambodia, because bombs meant for someone else hit innocent people. Because secret wars have real consequences. It's important to remember, the US didn't cause the Khmer Rouge, but the chaos, the bombings, the civil war, all helped them rise. By the mid-70s, Cambodia was in ruins. So was Laos, which had also suffered under a secret war led by the CIA, using local tribes to fight the North Vietnamese. That's a story for another chapter, but together, these countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, had been torn apart by decades of fighting, whole generations lost, families broken, cities gone, hope shattered, and still. The Vietnam War wasn't quite over, because as South Vietnam struggled to hold on, the North was preparing for one final push. It would come soon, and it would end with helicopters lifting off rooftops in a city that once stood strong. That's the next chapter. Chapter 17, Kent State and the Breaking Point. Student protests turned deadly. America's youth rebels. The war had gone too far from its original goals, too far into lands it wasn't supposed to touch, and now it had come home. In April 1970, Americans turned on their televisions to hear shocking news. The war in Vietnam had expanded into Cambodia. After years of protest, after promises of peace, President Richard Nixon had ordered U.S. troops to invade a neutral country. To many Americans, especially the young, this felt like a betrayal. Nixon had promised to end the war. Instead, it seemed like he was dragging the country deeper into it, and that betrayal would explode across college. Campuses in protests, chants, and marches, but on one campus, the anger turned to bloodshed, and 4 young lives were lost. It started with a speech. On April 30th, 1970, Nixon appeared on national television. He told the country that U.S. forces were now in Cambodia, targeting the headquarters of the entire communist military operation. To his supporters, it sounded bold. To his critics, it sounded like an escalation. The very next day, college campuses across the country erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, students gathered to protest the invasion. They chanted. They held signs. They burned copies of the Constitution. symbolizing how the government was betraying its own promises. By May 1st, the protests had grown. Some students clashed with police in downtown Kent. A few threw bottles and rocks. Trash cans were overturned. Windows were smashed. The local mayor, afraid things were spiraling out of control, called the Ohio National Guard. By May the 2nd, National Guard troops were on campus, armed with rifles and tear gas. Tensions rose quickly. That night, the ROTC building, which represented the military on campus, was set on fire by protesters. No one was hurt, but the symbolism was loud and clear. The military was not welcome. The war was not welcome, and now the fuse had been lit. On the morning of May 4, 1970, students gathered again for a protest. Around 2,000 people, students, bystanders, some faculty, stood on a grassy hill near the center of campus. The National Guard, about 100 troops in full gear, ordered them to disperse. The students refused. They shouted back. Some threw rocks and tear gas canisters. Some were just watching. Then came the moment no one expected. Just after noon, a group of guardsmen turned suddenly and fired into the crowd. It lasted just 13 seconds. In that short time, they fired 67 rounds. When the smoke cleared, 4 students lay dead. 9 others were wounded. Some were protesters. Some weren't even involved. Some were just walking to class. America was stunned. Photos of the shooting, especially one of a girl kneeling and screaming beside a body, spread across newspapers, magazines, and television screens. It was clear. The war wasn't just tearing apart Southeast Asia anymore. It was tearing apart America. People asked, how did it come to this? How did young Americans, armed with signs, end up dead at the hands of their own soldiers? The Kent State shooting wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. It marked the moment when the generation gap, the cultural rift between young people and those in power, split wide open. Across the country, students walked out of class. Over 4 million students went on strike. More than 50 campuses shut down. It was the largest student protest in U.S. history. Protests were no longer just about Vietnam. They were about everything: civil rights, free speech, government lies, the draft, racism, injustice. Young people were saying that we don't trust you anymore. They were saying, you're sending us to die and killing us when we speak out. And Kent State wasn't the only place. Just 10 days later, on May 14, 1970, police opened fire on students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. They were protesting racism and the war. 2 students were killed. 12 were injured. But because Jackson State was a black college, the incident received far less national attention. Still, the message was clear. America was in crisis. The youth of the country no longer believed in its leaders, and its leaders no longer knew how to control the anger. This anger had been building for years. The Vietnam War was supposed to be a fight for freedom. But many Americans began to see it as a lie, a war built on bad information, questionable motives, and endless violence. The draft was a huge part of that anger. Young men were being forced to fight in a war they didn't believe in. Poor and working-class kids were drafted the most. Wealthier kids, especially those in college, found ways to avoid it. It felt unfair, it felt rigged, and it made everything worse. By 1970, the anti-war movement was no longer just a fringe group. It included students, veterans, mothers, teachers, even some politicians. Marches in Washington, D.C. drew hundreds of thousands. Vietnam veterans began protesting too, throwing their medals onto the Capitol steps. They weren't cowards. They had fought. They had seen the jungle. They had watched friends die, and they came home saying, this war is wrong. Kent State became a symbol of what happens when governments stop listening, a symbol of how fear can turn deadly, a symbol of the cost, not just in Vietnam but here at home. For Nixon, the shootings were a nightmare. He defended the Guard's actions at first, but privately he was shaken. He called student protesters bums. But even his own staff told him, "Sir, we are losing an entire generation." In the years that followed, the war would grind on: Cambodia, Laos, secret bombings, peace talks that went nowhere. But something had changed in America. Trust was broken. Faith in government, in leadership, in truth, it all began to unravel. And the war didn't just hurt those who fought it, it damaged the soul of the country. Some said the students at Kent State were rebels, others said they were heroes, but most just said this: they were kids and they died in a war they weren't even fighting, on a campus that should have been a safe place to speak freely. Their names were Alison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, William Schroeder. They were 19 and 20 years old. Their lives were cut short, and their deaths made America ask a terrifying question. If we're killing our own children, what are we fighting for? The echoes of that day still linger. You can visit Kent State today. There's a memorial, a museum, a quiet hill where the shots rang out, but more than anything, there's silence. And in that silence, a lesson. Wars don't just kill people overseas. They destroy things at home too. They break trust. They divide generations. They leave scars that don't fade. The protests didn't stop the war overnight, but they changed the conversation. They forced the country to look in the mirror, and what it saw was broken. Chapter 18. Peace Talks and Power Plays. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Thousands of lives had been lost, millions more were displaced, and the cost, both in money and human spirit, was staggering. The American public was exhausted. The soldiers in the jungle were exhausted. Even the leaders in Washington, Hanoi, and Saigon were exhausted. The war had become a stalemate. Neither side could claim a clear victory, but neither side was willing to quit. Amid this stalemate, hope began to flicker in the form of peace talks. For years there had been attempts at negotiation, but none had led to lasting results. Now, in 1968, after the shock of the Tet Offensive, both sides saw the value in talking. These negotiations would come to be known as the Paris Peace Talks. They began in May 1968, in the heart of France's capital, a city famous for diplomacy, art, and history. The talks brought together 4 main players: the United States, representing South Vietnam; the North Vietnamese government, including the Viet Cong fighting for reunification; the South Vietnamese government, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu; and the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong political arm. The room was filled with tension. These weren't friendly discussions. Each side entered with hard demands, deep suspicion, and a long list of grievances. For the United States, the goal was simple: get American troops out while keeping South Vietnam independent and free from communist rule. For North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, the goal was just as clear: get the US out, reunify the country under communist control, and end what they called American imperialism. The talks began with a flurry of rhetoric, speeches, and accusations. But progress was slow. One of the main sticking points was the ceasefire. North Vietnam wanted a total ceasefire, with US troops withdrawing immediately. The US wanted a ceasefire only after certain conditions were met, like stopping communist attacks. Another major issue was the future of South Vietnam. North Vietnam demanded political control, or at least the presence of their representatives in the South. The US and South Vietnam refused to consider anything that would threaten the South Vietnamese government's power. Behind the scenes, the talks became a game of power plays and stalling tactics. Sometimes negotiators seemed more interested in scoring political points than making peace. American diplomats used delaying tactics to buy time for the US military to continue its operations. North Vietnamese negotiators sometimes rejected proposals outright, hoping to wear down the Americans. It was a dangerous dance, one that frustrated many watching from the outside. Despite the tension, some small agreements were reached. There was a mutual agreement to stop bombing certain areas, called bombing halts, but these were often broken. Prisoner exchanges became a small symbol of goodwill. Thousands of American POWs were held captive in North Vietnam. Negotiators debated fiercely over how and when prisoners would be released. At one point, the US demanded the immediate release of all prisoners as a condition for peace talks to continue. North Vietnam refused. Years would pass before any real progress was made on this issue. Meanwhile, the war on the ground continued. In South Vietnam, Fighting raged as soldiers battled through rice paddies, jungles, and villages. In Washington, President Nixon and his administration pursued a secret strategy: Vietnamization. The idea was to gradually hand control of the war to South Vietnamese forces, while slowly withdrawing American troops. But at the negotiating table, the U.S. still held the cards. Bombing campaigns intensified to pressure North Vietnam into agreeing. One of the most controversial moments during the peace talks was the Christmas bombing of 1972. Officially known as Operation Linebacker to Two, it was a massive bombing campaign over North Vietnam. For 11 days, American B-52 bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. The goal was to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table and accept the U.S. terms. But the bombing caused enormous destruction and civilian casualties. It shocked the world and further divided opinion about the war. After the Christmas bombing, North Vietnam returned to the talks. By January 1973, negotiators reached a breakthrough. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The agreement had several key points: a ceasefire across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the withdrawal of all U.S. combat troops within 60 days, the return of all prisoners of war, recognition of the political status quo, meaning South Vietnam would remain independent until reunification negotiations could continue peacefully, a framework for future political settlements between North and South Vietnam. At first, the accords were hailed as a victory. Thousands of American troops began to come home. POWs were released and reunited with their families. But beneath the celebrations lay deep problems. The ceasefire was fragile. Violations happened almost immediately. Both sides accused each other of breaking the agreement. South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu refused to cooperate fully with the terms, fearing communist infiltration and loss of power. North Vietnam continued its military build-up in the south. Fighting quietly resumed, though the U.S. was no longer directly involved. The peace talks had achieved a formal end to American involvement in the war, but not peace in Vietnam. Many Americans felt betrayed. They had been told peace was coming. They wanted the war to be over, but the reality was more complicated. The accords were a temporary truce, not a permanent peace. The real fight for Vietnam's future was still to come. Meanwhile, Washington grappled with the fallout. The war had changed American politics forever. Congress passed laws to limit the president's power to wage war without approval. The War Powers Act of 1973 was a direct response, requiring the president to consult Congress before sending troops into combat. This was a clear sign that the Vietnam War had reshaped how America viewed military power and democracy. In Vietnam, the fragile peace held for a few years, but by 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive. Without U.S. military support, South Vietnam's government collapsed quickly. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell. The Vietnam War was finally over. But the peace talks, while ending direct U.S. involvement, could not resolve the deep divisions and conflicts that had torn the country apart. They were a reminder that diplomacy is never simple. Behind closed doors, the players made deals, bargained for advantage, and tried to shape the future of a divided nation. Some saw the Paris Peace Accords as a necessary step toward ending a brutal conflict. Others saw them as a failed attempt that only delayed the inevitable. The legacy of the peace talks is complicated. They represent the hope for peace, the cost of war, and the limits of power. And as Vietnam moved forward, the world watched closely, learning lessons that would influence diplomacy and war for generations to come. Chapter 19. The Ceasefire That Wasn't. After U.S. troops withdraw, the fighting continues. South Vietnam hangs by a thread. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 brought hope to many. After years of brutal conflict, it seemed, the war might finally be ending. American troops began their withdrawal, and the promise of peace felt real for the first time in a long while. But this ceasefire, this fragile agreement, was not what it seemed. Almost immediately, the ceasefire started to unravel. The guns did not fall silent. Instead, fighting continued, in some places even more fiercely than before. The promise of peace quickly gave way to a new kind of war, one without American soldiers on the ground, but just as deadly. South Vietnam, now alone in the fight, was hanging by a thread. The year 1973 marked the official end of direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. More than 500,000 American troops had already returned home, and by March 1973, the last combat soldiers left Vietnamese soil. For many Americans, the war was over, but for the people of Vietnam, the war had not ended. The Paris Peace Accords included a ceasefire clause, but the ceasefire was shaky, almost a suggestion rather than a firm promise. Both sides accused each other of violating the ceasefire almost from day one. North Vietnamese troops, still organized and motivated, continued to press their offensive. In the south, they slowly expanded control over more rural areas, using guerrilla tactics and regular military forces. South Vietnamese soldiers, under President Nguyen Van Thieu's leadership, struggled to maintain control. Their forces were poorly supplied, demoralized, and weakened after years of war. The American financial and military support that had once kept South Vietnam strong was rapidly drying up. Congress had cut aid as anger over the war grew back home. Without U.S. air power and ground support, South Vietnam was forced to fight a war on its own terms, and it was not prepared. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were young and inexperienced, thrown into a brutal war zone with little training or morale. Corruption among military leaders and government officials weakened the South Vietnamese war effort from within. Meanwhile, North Vietnam took advantage of the situation. They saw the ceasefire not as a step toward peace, but as a pause to regroup and strengthen. New troops poured into the south through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of paths and tunnels through Laos and Cambodia. Supplies flowed steadily, and the Viet Cong insurgency in the south grew stronger. They staged attacks and ambushes, often disappearing into the jungle before South Vietnamese forces could respond. In cities, North Vietnamese sympathizers and agents worked to undermine the government from within. The fragile truce was a thin veil covering the harsh reality of continued conflict. For ordinary Vietnamese civilians, the war meant uncertainty, fear, and lost villages caught between the two sides were often battlegrounds. Families were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees. Millions were displaced by the ongoing violence. In the United States, the war was increasingly forgotten, replaced by new political crises and social movements. But for those still fighting in Vietnam, the war continued every day. President Nixon had promised peace with honor, but peace was elusive. In 1974, the situation worsened rapidly. North Vietnam launched a large-scale offensive, known as the Easter Offensive. Unlike previous guerrilla tactics, this was a conventional attack. Large numbers of tanks, artillery, and troops moving openly against South Vietnamese positions. The South Vietnamese army fought hard, supported by limited American airstrikes and military aid, but the offensive exposed serious weaknesses in South Vietnam's military. Some provinces fell quickly, and panic spread among civilians. The American public was largely unaware of the full extent of the fighting. After the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation in August 1974, U.S. political attention shifted inward. President Gerald Ford took office during a time of crisis. He pushed Congress for more military and economic aid to South Vietnam. But Congress was reluctant, still haunted by the cost and failure of the war. Aid was limited and late. Without sufficient support, South Vietnam struggled to mount an effective defense. North Vietnam kept pushing. Throughout 1974 and early 1975, North Vietnamese forces gained ground. Major cities and provinces fell one by one. South Vietnam's government became increasingly unstable. President Thieu's leadership was criticized for corruption and poor strategy. Morale among soldiers and civilians plummeted. Reports of desertion and rebellion within the South Vietnamese army increased. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched its final push, the Spring Offensive. They targeted the Central Highlands and moved rapidly toward Saigon. The South Vietnamese forces collapsed under the pressure. Thousands of soldiers surrendered or fled. The world watched as the last defenses crumbled. The ceasefire that was supposed to bring peace had become a distant memory. The war continued, with greater intensity and desperation than ever before. On April 21, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the outskirts of Saigon. The South Vietnamese government was in chaos. President Thieu resigned and fled the country. 2 days later, on April 30th, the city fell. The American embassy was evacuated in a hurried and chaotic airlift. The Vietnam War was finally over, but at a terrible cost. Millions of Vietnamese were dead, wounded, or displaced. The country was left divided and devastated. The ceasefire had failed because the deep political and military conflicts were never truly resolved. Both sides saw the truce as a chance to gain advantage, rather than a step toward peace. The legacy of the ceasefire is a reminder that wars do not always end with neat agreements. Sometimes, the battles continue long after the guns are supposed to be silent. South Vietnam's fragile hold on independence was shattered. Vietnam would be reunified under communist rule. The American people were left to grapple with the meaning of a war that had cost so much. For the Vietnamese, the years following the ceasefire were years of rebuilding, but also of pain and memory. The ceasefire that wasn't showed that peace agreements, without trust and enforcement, are fragile. It taught the world lessons about diplomacy, war, and the human cost of conflict. Chapter 20. The Fall of Saigon. April 30th, 1975. Evacuation chaos. North Vietnam captures Saigon. The war ends. Vietnam is reunified. The spring of 1975 was a time of desperation and final reckoning. North Vietnamese forces were advancing rapidly toward Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. For years, Saigon had been the political, military, and economic heart of South Vietnam. Now it was about to fall. The fall of Saigon marked the end of a long and bitter war that had shaped the lives of millions and changed the world. As the North Vietnamese army closed in, panic spread among South Vietnamese officials and civilians. The city, once vibrant and bustling, became a scene of chaos and fear. The American government, after years of involvement, was now preparing for a rapid evacuation. For the United States, the fall of Saigon was not just a military defeat, but a national trauma. After spending billions of dollars and risking thousands of American lives, the U.S. was forced to abandon its ally and leave the country to its fate. The evacuation plan was called Operation Frequent Wind. It was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Thousands of Americans, South Vietnamese military personnel, government officials and their families were airlifted from rooftops and military bases in Saigon. Scenes of helicopters hovering over the city, landing on the U.S. Embassy rooftop, became iconic images of the war's chaotic end. People clung desperately to helicopters, hoping for a chance to escape. Many who wanted to flee were left behind. The streets were filled with terrified South Vietnamese civilians, many of whom had supported the U.S. or the South Vietnamese government. They feared retribution from the North Vietnamese communists. Families tried to gather what they could and join the evacuation. The American embassy became a hub of frenetic activity, as staff worked to process evacuation papers and organize flights. In the final days before the city fell, the South Vietnamese government was collapsing. President Nguyen Van Thieu had already resigned and fled the country. His successor, General Duong Van Minh, tried to negotiate a peaceful surrender to prevent more bloodshed. But North Vietnamese forces made it clear that they intended a full takeover. April 30th, 1975, is remembered as the day Saigon fell. At dawn, North Vietnamese tanks broke through the city's gates. Soldiers marched into government buildings, raised the red flag of communism, and declared victory. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the streets. For many South Vietnamese, the end of the war was not a relief, but the beginning of a new nightmare. Thousands were arrested, sent to re-education camps, or forced to flee their homeland. Vietnam was reunified under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war that had lasted for 2 decades and cost millions of lives was officially over. The fall of Saigon was a moment of sorrow for those who had fought and lost, but it also marked the start of a new chapter for Vietnam. The country faced enormous challenges. The war had left the land devastated. Cities and villages were destroyed. The economy was in ruins. Millions were dead. And millions more were wounded or displaced. The new government set about rebuilding the country under communist rule. Efforts were made to unify the North and South politically and economically, but the scars of war remained deep. Families were torn apart. People who had once been allies found themselves on opposite sides. Many South Vietnamese who had supported the American-backed government faced persecution. In the years following the fall of Saigon, a massive exodus of refugees began. Known as the Boat People, hundreds of thousands risked dangerous sea voyages to escape the new regime. Many died at sea, victims of storms, pirates, or overcrowded boats. Those who survived often faced hardship in refugee camps before being accepted by other countries. The United States accepted many Vietnamese refugees, but the pain of losing Vietnam still lingered. The Fall of Saigon was a bitter chapter in American history. It symbolized the limits of American power and the consequences of a long and controversial war. The images of helicopters lifting off the embassy rooftop, desperate crowds and abandoned streets became symbols of defeat and loss. But for Vietnam, it was a moment of hope and rebuilding. Over time, Vietnam slowly recovered. Trade opened with other countries. The economy began to grow again. Today, Vietnam is a unified country with a rich culture and history, shaped by the struggles of its past. The Fall of Saigon remains a powerful reminder of the human cost of war. It teaches us that behind every headline and political decision are real people, with hopes, fears, and lives forever changed. The Vietnam War may have ended on April 30th, 1975, but its lessons continue to resonate. Chapter 21. What was lost? Human cost. Over 3 million dead. Scars on land, mines, and families. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, but its consequences lasted for decades, long after the last shots were fired. What was lost during this brutal conflict cannot be measured simply by the number of years it lasted or the battles fought. It is a story of human suffering on a massive scale. Over 3 million people died during the Vietnam War, civilians, soldiers, and innocent bystanders caught in the middle of a war they did not choose. For every life lost, countless others were changed forever. Families torn apart, bodies broken, and minds scarred. The human cost was staggering. In South Vietnam alone, an estimated 2 million civilians lost their lives. Many died in battles, while others were victims of bombing campaigns or caught in the crossfire of guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong also suffered heavy casualties. Military deaths numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Every village, every town was affected. The United States lost over 58,000 soldiers, but numbers only tell part of the story. More than 300,000 American soldiers were wounded, some permanently. Many returned home with invisible wounds, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, struggling to adjust to life after the war. The war left deep psychological scars on both sides. Vietnamese civilians lived in constant fear. The jungles and countryside were riddled with landmines, unexploded bombs, and booby traps. Walking outside could mean sudden death. Thousands of children were orphaned. Communities were displaced as villages were destroyed to make way for military bases or bombing runs. The war also tore apart families and communities. Vietnamese families were split between North and South. Some chose to flee, others were forced to stay. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully found themselves on opposing sides, sometimes turning against each other. After the war, many South Vietnamese faced persecution for their ties to the old government or the United States. Re-education camps became prisons where thousands were held in harsh conditions. These camps aimed to change minds, but often broke spirits. The land itself bore the marks of war. The jungles that once covered Vietnam were scarred by years of bombing and defoliation campaigns. The U.S. military dropped millions of gallons of Agent Orange, a chemical designed to kill plants, to remove forest cover from the enemy. While effective in clearing vegetation, it left a toxic legacy. Agent Orange contaminated the soil and water. It caused serious health problems for generations, including cancers, birth defects, and other illnesses. The effects are still felt. Today, villages and farmland were destroyed. Land that had been cultivated for centuries became unusable. Many people lost their livelihoods. Infrastructure like roads, bridges, and schools were damaged or destroyed, setting back development for years. The war also created millions of refugees. Those who survived often fled their homes in search of safety. Some escaped by boat, facing dangerous seas and uncertain futures. These refugees became known as the boat people. Many countries around the world offered refuge. The United States welcomed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, many of whom started new lives far from the war zone. But for those left behind, the loss was deeper than just land or possessions. It was a loss of hope and normal life. Millions struggled. With grief and trauma, they lost loved ones, homes, and the futures they had dreamed of. In the United States, the war also caused divisions. Returning veterans faced hostility or indifference. Many were haunted by memories of what they had seen or done. Families struggled to understand the pain their loved ones carried. The war changed America's view of itself and its role in the world. It was the first time in modern history that television brought brutal images of war directly into people's homes. The nightly news showed graphic scenes of battle, protests, and suffering. For many Americans, the war became a symbol of failure and loss. It sparked debates over foreign policy and the limits of military power that still resonate today. For Vietnam, the war's legacy is both tragic and complex. The country had to rebuild from ruins, physically, politically, and socially. Yet, despite the devastation, Vietnam found ways to heal. Efforts were made to reunite the country and restore the economy. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia, a testament to its resilience. But the memories of war remain. Memorials stand across Vietnam and the world, honoring those who lost their lives. The scars on the land remind new generations of the cost of conflict, and for many families, the loss is personal and ongoing. Vietnamese and American families alike continue to remember those who never came home. The Vietnam War was more than a battle for territory or ideology. It was a human tragedy, full of loss and pain. Its impact stretched beyond the battlefield into the hearts and minds of millions. As we look back, we remember the cost, not just in numbers, but in lives forever changed. Understanding what was lost is a step toward healing and peace. It reminds us why war must always be a last resort, and why its effects last long after the guns fall silent. Chapter 22, POWs and MIA, the forgotten soldiers, prisoners missing in action, and the families left behind. The Vietnam War didn't end for everyone in 1975. For some families, it never truly ended at all. There were the soldiers who came home, and those who didn't. Some were killed and buried. Some disappeared without a trace, and others were captured, held as prisoners of war under brutal, secretive conditions. These men, the POWs, prisoners of war, and the MIAs, those missing in action, represent one of the most painful chapters of the Vietnam conflict. They became symbols of sacrifice, of suffering, and tragically of silence. From the early years of the war, American servicemen were captured by North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong. They were often pilots, shot down while bombing missions took place over North Vietnam. Others were soldiers taken during ambushes or raids. These men were marched for miles, often barefoot and bleeding, deep into enemy territory. They were locked in small, dark cells, sometimes underground, sometimes in bamboo cages. Some ended up in a place that would become infamous, Hoa Lo Prison, nicknamed by the Americans as the Hanoi Hilton. It wasn't a hotel, it was a place of pain. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, POWs faced constant interrogations, starvation, and isolation. Their captors wanted confessions, statements, propaganda footage to show the world that America's war effort was failing. And when the men refused to cooperate, the beatings began. One prisoner, future U.S. Senator John McCain was shot down over Hanoi in 1967. He had broken arms and a shattered leg, but was denied proper medical care. He nearly died. He spent over 5 years in captivity, 2 of them in solitary confinement. McCain was one of hundreds of American POWs held during the war. Their days blurred into weeks and their weeks into years. They tapped coded messages to each other through walls. They memorized lists of names, so that if one man got out, he could tell the world who was still alive inside. They held on to routines, discipline, and small acts of resistance to survive. Some were tortured so badly they could no longer move properly. Some never returned. Back home, their families waited. Many received letters saying their loved one was missing. Some were told they were captured. Others got nothing. The government didn't always have answers. Some families waited years just to hear if their son or husband was alive. These families started their own movement. They organized vigils, wrote letters, and demanded answers. The POW-MIA movement was born, not from politics, but from grief and determination. They created the black and white POW-MIA flag, a silhouette of a prisoner with a guard tower in the background. It became a powerful symbol seen across the country, a silent reminder that not everyone had come home. By the time the war ended in 1975, the official number of Americans unaccounted for was over 2,500. During Operation Homecoming in 1973, about 591 American POWs were released and flown home. It was a moment of celebration, but also of heartbreak, because for thousands of families, their loved ones were not on that plane. The government told them that many of the missing were probably dead, but some families refused to believe it. There were rumors, eyewitness accounts from other prisoners, whispers that some POWs had been moved to other prisons, even into Laos, Cambodia, or even the Soviet Union. Over the years, some former POWs claimed to have heard American voices in unknown camps. Satellite photos were said to show possible prison compounds in remote jungles. Others said they had seen carvings or coded symbols scratched into rocks or trees, left behind by someone hoping to be found. None of it could be confirmed, but it created a haunting question. Were American soldiers still being held years after the war ended? The U.S. government launched investigations. Presidents and senators promised answers. Task forces traveled to Vietnam. Dozens of search missions tried to recover remains, identify bones, and bring closure to the families. Sometimes they succeeded. A helmet, a dog tag, a set of bones buried beneath jungle soil. DNA testing helped return some soldiers home, decades after they vanished, but many families are still waiting. The Vietnamese government was not always cooperative. In the years following the war, U.S.-Vietnam relations were tense. It wasn't until the 1990s that the two countries began serious cooperation on locating missing soldiers. For the Vietnamese, the issue was complex too. Hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers and civilians were missing. Mass graves were never marked. Entire regions had been devastated by bombings. Their losses were immense, and many had no graves to visit either. The pain of the war was shared, even if the sides had been enemies. For those Americans who returned from captivity, the adjustment was hard. They had been gone for years. They missed births, deaths, and entire chapters of life back home. Some were celebrated as heroes. Others were haunted by nightmares. The trauma of captivity never fully left. Many kept their pain silent, but over time, they began to share their stories. Books, interviews, documentaries. They talked about the small victories, like keeping their minds sharp with imaginary chess games. They talked about the friendships that kept them alive. And they spoke of the guilt they felt for surviving when others did not. As years passed, the government continued to work on the issue. The Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, was created to find and identify missing service members from past wars. Their mission is simple: bring them all home. They dig through crash sites, interview witnesses, use DNA to match remains with family members. It's slow work, but sacred work. As of now, more than 1,500 American soldiers from the Vietnam War remain unaccounted for. Each one of them has a name, a story, a family that never gave up. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, their names are read aloud. The black POW MIA flag still flies over government buildings, military bases, and small towns. It flies as a promise that they will not be forgotten, and that America will continue the search no matter how long it takes. This chapter of the Vietnam War reminds us that some wounds do not heal with peace treaties. They linger in the silence, in the waiting, in the empty chairs at dinner tables. The POWs and MIAs are more than numbers. They are fathers, brothers, sons, some barely out of high school when they disappeared. Their legacy is one of endurance, of bravery in the darkest conditions, and of families who refuse to let them be erased from history. What they endured, and what their families continue to endure, is a powerful reminder of the personal cost of war. As we remember the Vietnam War, we must also remember them, not just as prisoners or missing men, but as human beings who mattered, because a war doesn't truly end until everyone comes home. Chapter 23, The War Comes Home, PTSD, Disillusionment, Homelessness. The psychological war continues for U.S. veterans. For many American soldiers, Vietnam was supposed to end when they got on the plane home. They had survived the heat, the jungle, the gunfire. They had made it through ambushes, landmines, and nights filled with fear. But when they stepped off the plane and back onto U.S. soil, another war began. It was a war no one prepared them for. It was silent, invisible, but just as real. The war inside the mind. During World War II, soldiers came home to parades and cheers. They were seen as heroes. But for Vietnam veterans, the welcome was cold, sometimes even hostile. Many Americans had turned against the war. They were angry. They were tired of the lies, the images of burning villages, the body counts on TV, and in that anger, they confused the war with the warrior. Some veterans were spat on, called baby killers, ignored by people they once called neighbors. They didn't ask for this war. Most were drafted. They went because their country told them to. And now, back home, they felt like strangers in their own country. No one wanted to talk about what they'd seen. No one understood the nightmares, the flashbacks, the fear that came out of nowhere. Many didn't know it at the time, but they were experiencing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It wasn't well understood in the 1970s. Back then it was often called combat fatigue or shell shock. Some doctors didn't even believe it was real, but it was. Veterans would hear a car backfire and dive for cover. They'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. They couldn't sit in restaurants unless their backs were to the wall. Loud. Noises, crowds, helicopters in the sky, all could bring back memories they wanted to forget. Some couldn't hold jobs. Relationships fell apart. They withdrew, turned to alcohol, to drugs. They felt alone, broken, and ashamed. The U.S. government didn't have systems in place to help them. The VA, Veterans Affairs, was underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Counseling was rare. Waiting lists were long, and many veterans didn't even know they could ask for help. By the 1980s, the effects of the war were impossible to ignore. A disproportionate number of Vietnam veterans were homeless. In city after city, veterans lived in shelters, under bridges, in alleys, still carrying the weight of a war that ended years before. They were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Many still wore old army jackets. Some still had shrapnel in their bodies, but the deeper wounds were the ones no X-ray could see. It took time, too much time, for the country to listen. Veterans organizations, like Vietnam Veterans of America, began to speak out. They marched, testified before Congress, demanded recognition and treatment for PTSD. Slowly, the government responded. In 1980, PTSD was officially recognized as a mental health diagnosis by the American Psychiatric Association. That opened the door for research, for treatment programs, for benefits, but it didn't erase the years of silence. Veterans began to share their stories through books, interviews, films. They talked about what it was like to be a 19-year-old kid in a place where nothing made sense, where a child could be a lookout where the jungle could kill you and where you could lose your best friend in an instant. They spoke of guilt. Not just survivors' guilt, but the guilt of what they had to do to survive. Some had killed civilians, accidentally, in the chaos of war. Others carried the memory of moments when they couldn't save a friend. These weren't things they could talk about at the dinner table. The trauma stayed with them. It shaped their lives. Some found healing in helping others. They became counselors, mentors, writers. They built communities of veterans who understood each other without needing to explain. Others never found peace. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was, and still is, alarming. Even decades later, the memories don't fade. The war still lives in the minds of many who fought it. But this chapter isn't just about pain. It's also about resilience. Some veterans returned home and went on to build families, careers, and strong communities. They turned their struggle into strength. They became voices for mental health awareness, for better treatment of all veterans from all wars. They fought for the right to be heard, to be understood, to be remembered, not just as soldiers, but as people. In recent years, the country has tried to make amends. There are now better resources for PTSD, therapy, group counseling, crisis lines. Veterans centers have expanded. New legislation continues to push for more care, more access, but the scars are still there, on the land, on the heart, in the quiet of the night when the jungle returns behind closed eyes. Vietnam veterans taught the nation a hard lesson, that the end of a war isn't marked by a peace treaty. It's marked by how well we care for those who return, that a handshake and a thank you aren't enough, that real honor means action, help, support, understanding. Today, as we see younger generations of veterans come home from Iraq and Afghanistan, many of the systems built after Vietnam are helping them too. That's part of the legacy of the Vietnam generation. They made sure the pain they endured wouldn't be repeated. They turned their suffering into a kind of service, and that's something worth remembering, because for those who served, the battle doesn't always end on the battlefield. It continues in memory, in the soul, in the long, often lonely road of healing. We owe them more than medals. We owe them care, compassion, and the truth. Chapter 24, The Ghosts of Indochina, Fallout in Cambodia and Laos, Genocide, Landmines, and the Legacy of Destruction. When the Vietnam War ended in 1975, the fighting stopped. But the violence didn't. Instead, it spread, like a fire jumping from one forest to another. While the world watched helicopters lift off rooftops in Saigon, something even darker was unfolding just beyond the headlines, in Cambodia and Laos. These two nations, dragged into a war they never declared, would pay a terrible price, and decades later they are still haunted by it. Let's start with Laos. Most Americans didn't know it at the time, but Laos became the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on this small rural country, more than it dropped during all of World War II. This secret campaign was known as the Secret War. The goal? To disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes used by North Vietnam that snaked through Laos and Cambodia. But the reality was brutal. Village after village was wiped out. Fields were cratered. Families were torn apart. The US wasn't just bombing enemy positions, it was bombing entire landscapes. And not all the bombs exploded. Roughly 30% of them failed to detonate. They remained buried in the soil, sleeping, waiting. Even today, decades after the war, these unexploded ordnance, called UXOs, continue to maim and kill farmers, children, and innocent civilians. A child picks up what looks like a metal ball in a field and never comes home. A farmer strikes something with his hoe, and everything goes silent. In Laos, war didn't just happen. It stayed. To this day, people walk carefully in certain regions. The ground itself is dangerous. The past is literally beneath their feet. Meanwhile, across the border in Cambodia, another nightmare was beginning. The US had launched a massive bombing campaign there too, starting in 1969. They were targeting suspected Viet Cong sanctuaries. But as in Laos, civilians paid the price. The countryside was shaken. Refugees flooded cities like Phnom Penh. The fabric of society was unraveling. Into this chaos stepped a man named Pol Pot and his group, the Khmer Rouge. They promised to rebuild Cambodia, to throw off foreign influence, to return to a pure agrarian society. But what they built was a killing machine. In 1975, as Saigon fell, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. They declared Year Zero. Everything modern, everything Western, everything connected to the past was erased. They emptied the cities, forced millions into the countryside. Families were separated. Glasses, books, watches, evidence of education or urban life became death sentences. What followed was one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. Between 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the population, died. Between 1975 and 1979, people died from starvation, from forced labor, from disease, and from execution. The Khmer Rouge set up killing fields, remote sites where victims were murdered with axes, hammers, and blunt tools to save bullets. Mass graves were filled with teachers, doctors, monks, children, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone who questioned the regime. And behind this horror hauntingly lay the shadows of the Vietnam War. The US bombings had weakened the Cambodian government. The chaos created a vacuum that the Khmer Rouge exploited. A war that started to stop communism helped give birth to one of the most brutal communist regimes the world has ever seen. Eventually, in 1979, it was Vietnam, ironically, that stepped in. Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, overthrew Pol Pot, and ended the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror. But the damage was done. Entire generations lost, a country scarred beyond recognition. Today, the killing fields of Cambodia remain, not just as historical sites, but as graveyards of memory, skulls stacked in glass towers, bones emerging from the soil during the rainy season, clothing fibers still clinging to the earth. Cambodians still live with the trauma. Many survivors never got justice. Pol Pot died in 1998, never truly punished for his crimes, and in Laos, the legacy of war is more silent, but just as deadly. UXO removal teams work tirelessly, combing the countryside with metal detectors. It will take decades, possibly centuries, to clear the land. In the meantime, development is slow. Fear is constant. A generation born after the war still suffers from it. Children grow up learning how to spot a bomb. Farmers take out life insurance before working in the fields. It is a war that never left. And this is the hidden cost of the Vietnam War. It didn't end in Saigon. It spilled across borders, across years, across generations. It fractured nations that were never part of the original fight. It turned civilians into casualties. It created ghosts, not just of people, but of entire ways of life. Today, Cambodia and Laos are rebuilding. Tourists visit temples, cities buzz with energy. But underneath it all, the war lingers, in trauma, in memory, in soil and in silence. Because for too long this part of the story was ignored, overshadowed by the images of US helicopters and jungle battles, forgotten by history books and headlines. But it matters. Because when war touches a region, it doesn't stop at the border. It doesn't end when the last soldier leaves. It echoes in bombs, in graves, in the faces of survivors. The ghosts of Indochina are real, and they still whisper. Chapter 25. Lessons, Lies, and Legacy. What the Vietnam War taught us or failed to teach. War powers, public trust, and the shadow it casts on future conflicts. The guns fell silent. The helicopters stopped flying. But the Vietnam War didn't really end, not in the way people hoped, because even after the last American left Saigon, the war followed us home, in memory, in mistrust, in every war that came after. Vietnam wasn't just a battlefield, it was a turning point, a mirror, a warning, a question we still haven't answered. What did we learn? Let's begin with the truth, or the lack of it. For many Americans, Vietnam marked the first time they realized their government could lie to them on such a massive scale. It wasn't just battlefield mistakes or fog of war confusion. It was systematic. From the Gulf of Tonkin incident which pushed the US into full-scale war under questionable evidence, to the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that multiple administrations had misled the public for years. The truth was often buried beneath politics. Presidents told the people the war was going well when it wasn't. Generals reported progress, measured in body counts, not victories. Journalists uncovered contradictions. Veterans returned disillusioned. Trust collapsed. Before Vietnam, Americans believed what they were told. After Vietnam, that belief was shattered, and that changed everything. It sparked a wave of public skepticism toward institutions, toward government, the military, even the media. A kind of national scar formed. The era of blind patriotism was over. The war also changed how America goes to war. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, a law meant to check the president's ability to send troops into combat without congressional approval. The goal was simple. Never again should one man drag the nation into war without debate, without consent. But the effectiveness of that law remains up for debate. Presidents have often sidestepped it, citing emergencies or limited military actions, and Congress, fearing political backlash, has often looked the other way. Vietnam taught us that war must be accountable, but we've struggled to enforce that lesson. Then there's the media. Vietnam was the first televised war. For the first time, Americans saw combat up close, not sanitized, not heroic, but raw, real, bloody. Footage of burning villages, screaming children, wounded soldiers. It brought the horror into living rooms. Some say the media helped end the war by exposing the truth. Others argue it demoralized the public and undermined the mission. But one thing is certain: Vietnam changed how wars are shown and how they're sold. In later conflicts like the Gulf War or Iraq, journalists were embedded. Images were more controlled. Messaging was tighter. The chaos of Vietnam's open press was never repeated. The war also taught us about the limits of military power. The US had every advantage: technology, resources, manpower. Yet it couldn't win. Why? Because it wasn't just a military war. It was a political war, a cultural war, a war over hearts and minds. And that's where America struggled. The enemy wasn't always in uniform. The battlefield wasn't always clear. You couldn't win territory and call it progress. It was a lesson about asymmetrical warfare, one we'd revisit in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later. Another painful takeaway: victory isn't always possible. Not in the traditional sense. Sometimes the cost outweighs the goal. Sometimes staying longer just makes things worse. But knowing when to leave, that's hard, especially when lives are on the line. And then there's the legacy of those who served. For 8,000 Americans died. Hundreds of thousands were wounded. Millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians lost their lives. But beyond the numbers are the lives shaped and shattered by the war. Veterans returned home not to parades, but to protest. They carried trauma. Some were blamed. Others were forgotten. For years, Vietnam vets felt invisible, caught between national shame and personal pain. Today, we try to honor their service, even as we question the war itself. It's a delicate balance. Respect the warrior. Question the war. And then there's Vietnam itself, the country. Today, it's a unified nation, still communist, still carrying scars. But it has moved forward. American tourists now walk the streets of Hanoi. Old battlefields are visited not by soldiers, but by students. Trade has replaced conflict. Dialogue has replaced bombs. Vietnam has shown that healing is possible, but the road is long. And the past never fully disappears. Globally, the Vietnam War changed how the world saw America. It weakened US credibility. Allies questioned its judgment. Enemies saw its vulnerabilities, and in later conflicts, those echoes returned. In Iraq, when weapons of mass destruction weren't found, people remembered the lies of Vietnam. In Afghanistan, when victory proved elusive, people remembered the jungles of the Mekong. Vietnam became a metaphor, a cautionary tale, one used by politicians, pundits and protesters alike. Don't let this become another Vietnam, they'd say. But did we really learn? That's the haunting part, because many of the same patterns, rushed decisions, murky goals, manipulated truths, have played out again and again. Vietnam should have taught us about humility, about the cost of intervention, about the danger of pride. But history has a way of repeating when lessons go unheeded. Still, not all is lost. Out of the ashes came awareness. Veterans' care became a public issue. Mental health in the military was finally acknowledged. War reporting became more scrutinized. Civilians asked harder questions. Vietnam, in all its tragedy, sparked critical thinking, a refusal to accept simple answers to complex problems. It reminded us that patriotism isn't silence. It's engagement. It's holding leaders accountable. It's valuing lives over pride. And perhaps that's the real legacy, not just a war in Southeast Asia, but a wake-up call, a reminder that truth matters, that lives matter, that power must be watched, and that every time we march to war we carry the shadow of Vietnam with us forever.